The mayor's eye had gone dull, the light fading like embers drowning in ash. Ethan Crowley had seen that look before, 4 times in the last 3 weeks, each death carving deeper into what remained of his soul. His hands, calloused and rough from years of ranch work, trembled as they rested against Duchess's sweat-soaked neck. She'd been his father's favorite, the last living connection to a man who'd built an empire from nothing and left it to a son who was watching it die. "Easy, girl," Ethan whispered, though the words felt like lies. There was nothing easy about this. Nothing easy about the way her breathing had turned ragged and shallow, nothing easy about the foam gathering at her lips, nothing easy about the way her legs had given out 3 hours ago and refused to hold her weight again. The stable smelled like rot and failure. Hay that should have been golden was trampled into manure-streaked muck. The other stalls stood empty, their gates hanging open like mouths frozen in silent screams. Thunder, lightning, Copperfield, Dakota, Sage. 5 horses in 23 days, each one stronger than the last, each one dead within 48 hours of showing the first symptoms. The veterinarian had run out of theories after the second death. By the 4th, he'd stopped coming entirely. The townspeople had their own explanations, whispered over coffee at Miller's General Store and murmured in the pews on Sunday mornings. Cursed land, bad blood. The Crowley luck finally running dry. Ethan had stopped listening. What did it matter what they said? The truth was simple and brutal. He was losing everything, and he had no idea how to stop it. The sun had started its descent toward the Montana horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust that bled through the stable's open door. Beautiful, in the way that endings often were. Ethan had always loved this time of day, when the light turned soft and the shadows grew long. His father used to stand right where Duchess now lay dying, arms crossed, surveying the evening feeding with the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd built something worth preserving. Thomas Crowley had died 8 months ago. Heart attack, the doctor said. Quick and clean, the way a rancher would want to go. He'd left Ethan 12 horses, 200 acres, a reputation built over 30 years, and a legacy that seemed to be rotting from the inside out. "Mr. Crowley." The voice came from behind him, soft and unfamiliar. Ethan didn't turn. He'd told Jimmy, the stable hand, to go home hours ago. Told him there was nothing left to do but wait for the inevitable. If the kid had come back anyway, Ethan didn't have the energy to send him away again. "She's not going to make it through the night," Ethan said, his voice rough with exhaustion and something darker. "Might as well head on home. No sense both of us watching this." "I'm not Jimmy." The words were matter-of-fact, holding neither sympathy nor judgment. Something in the tone made Ethan's spine straighten. He turned slowly, his hand still resting on Duchess's neck. The woman standing in the stable doorway was silhouetted against the dying light, her features obscured by shadow and the golden haze of dust motes drifting through the air. She wore a dark traveling dress that had seen better days, the hem stained with road dust. A worn leather bag hung from one shoulder. Her posture was straight, almost rigid, as if she'd been trained to stand like a soldier. "Clara Whitmore," she said, and the name hit Ethan like a fist to the gut. The contract bride. The arrangement his father had made 6 months before he died, back when the ranch still held 12 horses and a future that seemed inevitable. A practical solution to a practical problem. Thomas Crowley needed someone to help run the household after his wife's death, and eventually, his son would need a wife. Clara Whitmore, a widow from Philadelphia with impeccable references and no family ties, needed a fresh start in financial security. The agreement had been simple. She'd arrive after Thomas's affairs were settled, marry Ethan in a civil ceremony, and take on the domestic responsibilities of the ranch. In exchange, she'd have a home, an income, and the Crowley name. No romance expected, no illusions about love. Just a transaction between practical people making practical choices. That was before the horses started dying, before the bank started sending letters, before everything his father had built began crumbling like a sandcastle against the tide. Ethan had written to her 4 weeks ago, explaining the situation and offering to void the contract. He'd been honest, brutal even. The ranch was failing. He had no money, no prospects, no future to offer anyone, let alone a woman who'd crossed half a country based on promises that no longer held weight. He'd expected a telegram in response, a brief acknowledgement and a polite withdrawal. Instead, she was standing in his stable, watching him kneel beside a dying horse like some kind of medieval penitent. "You shouldn't have come," Ethan said finally, turning back to Duchess. "I wrote you, told you the situation had changed. I got your letter. Then you know there's nothing here for you." "I can see that." Clara stepped further into the stable, her boots making soft sounds against the straw-covered floor. "Your letter said 5 horses dead. This makes 6. Not dead yet." Ethan's jaw tightened. Still got a few hours of suffering left in her. Clara moved closer, and Ethan caught his first clear look at her face. She was younger than he'd expected, late 20s, maybe 30 at most. Dark hair pulled back in a severe bun that made her cheekbones stand out sharp and angular. Eyes that were neither brown nor green, but some shade in between, the color of creek water after a storm. Her face held no softness, no gentle curves to suggest sympathy or warmth. She looked like a woman who'd learned early that kindness was a luxury she couldn't afford. She knelt across from him, ignoring the filth on the stable floor, and placed one hand on Duchess's shoulder. The mare's breathing stuttered, then steadied slightly. Clara's fingers moved with practiced confidence, feeling along the horse's neck, checking the pulse, examining the foam at her mouth with clinical detachment. "How long since the symptoms started?" Clara asked. "Yesterday morning. She was fine at dawn feeding. By noon she wouldn't eat. Evening she started sweating. Breathing went bad around midnight." "The others followed the same pattern?" "More or less." Ethan watched her hands move over Duchess's body, noting the way she pressed her fingers into specific points along the mare's abdomen. "You know horses?" "I know dying things." Clara leaned closer, examining Duchess's eyes, pulling back the lid to check the color beneath. "And I know poison when I see it." The word hung in the air like smoke. Ethan's hand stilled on Duchess's neck. "The vet ran tests," he said carefully. "Found nothing. Said it could be a disease, maybe something in the water, or—" "Your vet is an idiot." Clara sat back on her heels, her expression unreadable. "This isn't disease. Look at the foam. Smell it." Ethan had been trying not to smell anything for the past 3 hours, but he leaned forward anyway. The scent was bitter, almost acrid, cutting through the general stench of sweat and sickness. "That's not normal," Clara said. "Disease doesn't smell like that. And look here." She lifted Duchess's lip, exposing the gums. "See the discoloration? The way the tissue has started to break down? That's chemical damage, not infection. If it's poison, someone would have to be feeding it to them deliberately." Ethan's voice had gone hard. "I know every person who sets foot on this property. Nobody would—" "I didn't say deliberate." Clara stood, wiping her hands on a handkerchief she pulled from her pocket. "Could be something in their feed, something in the pasture, a plant they're eating that they shouldn't be. My father ran this ranch for 30 years. He knew every inch of this land. And in 30 years, things grow, things change, things spread." Clara's eyes met his, and Ethan saw something in them that made his breath catch. Not sympathy, not pity. Something harder and more useful. Certainty. "When did you last survey the grazing areas?" Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. The truth was, he hadn't. His father had died in July. By August, Ethan was drowning in paperwork, bank meetings, and the 1,000 small crises that came with running a ranch alone. The horses had been fine, healthy, strong, well-fed. He'd seen no reason to change their routine. The first death had come in late September. Thunder, a 3-year-old gelding his father had been training for sale. Then Lightning, Thunder's brother, 2 days later. Copperfield followed within a week. Dakota and Sage within days of each other. Each time, Ethan had moved the surviving horses to different pastures, trying to isolate the cause. Each time, another one got sick. "I moved them," Ethan said defensively. "After each death, I changed where they were grazing." "To where?" "Different sections, North Pasture, East Meadow, the lower fields near the creek." Clara's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes sharpened. "Show me a map of your property." "Now?" "Unless you'd prefer to watch this horse die first, and then show me after the next one gets sick." The words were brutal in their simplicity. Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to tell this stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere that she didn't know what she was talking about, that she had no right to waltz into his stable and start making pronouncements about things she couldn't possibly understand. But Duchess's breathing had gotten worse in the last few minutes. The rattling in her chest was louder, more labored. Her eye had gone completely dull. Ethan stood slowly, his knees protesting after hours of kneeling on hard ground. "There's a survey map in the house." "Good." Clara picked up her bag. "And while we're there, I'll need to see your feed storage, your water sources, and anything else the horses have regular access to." "You think you can figure this out? Just like that?" Ethan heard the skepticism in his own voice, mixed with something more desperate. Hope, maybe. Or the last gasps of it. Clara turned to look at him fully for the first time, and Ethan felt the weight of her gaze like a physical thing. There was no warmth in it, no gentle reassurance, just cold, hard assessment. "I think," she said slowly, "that you have two choices. You can keep doing what you've been doing, watching horses die one by one until there's nothing left, or you can trust that I might know something you don't." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I crossed half a country to honor a contract with a dead man and marry a stranger. I didn't do that because I give up easily. And I didn't come all this way to watch everything fall apart without at least trying to stop it." She walked past him toward the stable door, then paused at the threshold. "Are you coming, Mr. Crowley? Or would you prefer to keep kneeling in the dark?" Ethan looked down at Duchess. The mare's breathing had turned shallow, barely visible. She was minutes away now, maybe less. There was nothing he could do for her, nothing anyone could do. But maybe, there was something that could be done for the 6 horses still alive in the far pasture, the last remnants of his father's legacy. "Jimmy will sit with her," Ethan said quietly. "She shouldn't die alone." Clara nodded once, sharp and businesslike, then turned and walked out into the fading light. Ethan followed, leaving Duchess to her final moments, trying not to think about how many times he'd made this same walk in recent weeks, trying not to count the empty stalls, trying not to calculate how many more deaths it would take before the bank foreclosed and everything his father had built disappeared into history. The ranch house sat on a small rise overlooking the main paddocks, a 2-story structure built from local timber and stone that had weathered 3 decades of Montana winters without complaint. Thomas Crowley had built it himself, with help from neighbors and friends who'd since died or moved on. It was solid and practical, like everything Thomas had done. No wasted space, no unnecessary decoration, just 4 walls, a roof, and enough room to raise a family. Ethan's mother had died when he was 12. Cancer, slow and brutal, eating away at her for 2 years before she finally gave in. His father had raised him alone after that, teaching him everything about running a ranch through example rather than words. How to read weather in the sky, how to spot a sick animal before symptoms showed, how to fix what was broken and accept what couldn't be fixed. Thomas had never remarried, never even courted as far as Ethan knew. He'd poured everything into the land and the horses, building a reputation for quality stock that stretched across 3 states. By the time Ethan was 25, the Crowley Ranch was known as the place to go for strong, healthy horses with good bloodlines and better temperaments. Now, at 32, Ethan was watching that reputation die along with everything else. He pushed open the front door, holding it for Clara as she stepped inside. The house still smelled like his father, leather and pipe tobacco, coffee and wood smoke. Ethan had changed nothing since the funeral. Couldn't bring himself to pack away the old man's things, as if keeping them in place might somehow keep Thomas's presence alive in the walls. Clara set her bag down in the hallway and looked around with the same clinical assessment she'd given Duchess. Taking in the worn furniture, the dust gathering on surfaces Ethan hadn't had time or energy to clean, the stack of unopened mail piling up on the kitchen table. "The map?" she asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "Office. This way." Ethan led her down the narrow hallway to the small room his father had used for ranch business. The walls were lined with filing cabinets and shelves holding ledgers going back 30 years. A large desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with papers Ethan had been trying to organize for months without success. The survey map hung on the wall behind the desk, hand-drawn by Thomas years ago and updated regularly as he'd expanded the property. Clara stepped up to the map immediately, her eyes scanning the careful notations marking pastures, water sources, fencing, and buildings. Her finger traced the boundaries, following the lines that divided the ranch into distinct grazing areas. "Show me where each horse was pastured before it got sick," she said. Ethan moved to stand beside her, uncomfortably aware of how close they were in the small space. She smelled like train smoke and road dust, with an underlying scent of something medicinal. Carbolic soap, maybe. "Thunder and Lightning were here." He pointed to the north pasture. "Copperfield was here, in the east meadow. Dakota and Sage were here, near the creek. Duchess was—" He hesitated. "She was with the others when she got sick. I'd moved all the remaining horses to the south field after Sage died, trying to keep them away from wherever the problem was coming from." Clara's eyes narrowed. "And the 6 horses still alive?" "Still in the south field. I moved them again 2 days ago, after Duchess showed symptoms. They're in the smallest pasture now, closest to the house. I've been watching them constantly. So far, nothing." "So far?" Clara's finger traced a line from pasture to pasture, following the progression of deaths. "But they've all grazed in the south field at some point?" "Yes. I rotated them through there earlier in the summer. It's got the best grass, stays green longer than the others." "When did you first let them graze there?" Ethan thought back. "Early August, maybe? Right after my father died. I wanted to give them the best feed while I was dealing with everything else." Clara was silent for a long moment, her finger resting on the south field notation. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but certain. "That's your answer." "The south field? But they're not there now, and Duchess got sick after I'd already moved them out." "How long was she in the south field?" "A week, maybe 10 days. And the others? How long did each one spend there?" Ethan grabbed the ranch log from the desk, flipping through the pages where he had documented every movement, every feeding, every detail he could think of that might help explain the deaths. His handwriting had gotten progressively worse as the weeks went on, desperation creeping into the formation of letters and numbers. "Thunder and Lightning were there for 3 weeks before I moved them. Copperfield had 2 weeks. Dakota and Sage." He trailed off, seeing the pattern even as Clara undoubtedly already had. "They were there the longest, almost a month." "And the surviving 6? "Only a few days. I moved them out as soon as Copperfield got sick." Clara turned away from the map, her expression grim. "There's something in that field, something toxic that builds up in their systems over time. The longer they graze there, the more they consume, the worse the poisoning. Your father probably never used that pasture regularly, so he never encountered the problem. But I've walked that field 100 times. There's nothing there but grass and clover, same as the other pastures." "Then you weren't looking at the right things." Clara moved toward the door. "I need light, good light. Can this wait until morning?" "The horses won't eat anything tonight if you don't feed them. Keep them in their current location, give them hay only, no grazing, and we'll survey the south field at first light." She paused, looking back at him. "Unless you think Duchess will recover, and this is all unnecessary." The unspoken answer hung between them. Duchess was already gone, or would be within the hour. They both knew it. "There's a spare room upstairs," Ethan said finally. "It's not much, but it's clean. Or it was, last time anyone used it. I'll need water for washing, and something to eat if you have it. I haven't had a proper meal since yesterday." The mundane request jarred Ethan back to the reality of the situation. This woman, this stranger, had traveled across the country and walked into his dying ranch without hesitation. She'd spent the last hour analyzing a problem that had defeated him for weeks, and now she was standing in his hallway, covered in road dust and stable filth, asking for basic hospitality he hadn't even thought to offer. "Right, yes, I'll—" He gestured vaguely toward the kitchen. "There's stew, probably still warm, and bread from yesterday. It's not fancy, but I didn't come here for fancy, Mr. Crowley." Clara picked up her bag. "Which room?" "Top of the stairs, second door on the left." She nodded once and headed for the staircase, her boots making hollow sounds on the wooden steps. Halfway up, she paused and looked back. "Your father," she said. He must have been a good man to build all this. Ethan swallowed against the sudden tightness in his throat. He was the best man I ever knew. Then he deserves better than watching it all fall apart. Clara's eyes met his, hard and unflinching. And so do you. She continued up the stairs, leaving Ethan standing in the hallway, surrounded by the ghosts of everything he was losing. Through the window, he could see Jimmy's lantern bobbing across the yard toward the stable. The kid would sit with Duchess, would talk to her softly while she died, the way he'd done with all the others, would come back to the house afterward with red eyes and ask if there was anything else that needed doing, because Jimmy was 19 and still believed that hard work could fix anything. Ethan envied him that certainty. He made his way to the kitchen and ladled stew into 2 bowls, moving on autopilot. The routine was familiar. He'd been feeding himself for months now, mechanical meals eaten alone at the kitchen table while he tried not to look at the chair where his father used to sit. He set 1 bowl on the table for Clara and took the other to the window, eating standing up, watching the last of the daylight fade from the sky. The south field was visible from here, a dark expanse rolling away toward the tree line. In the growing darkness, it looked like any other pasture, peaceful, innocent. Just grass and clover and the gentle slope of Montana land that had fed horses for decades. But somewhere in that grass was a killer, something his father had never encountered, something that had been waiting, dormant perhaps, until Ethan had made the decision to graze there regularly. His father would have known. Thomas Crowley had possessed an almost supernatural awareness of the land, able to spot problems before they became catastrophic. He'd walked these fields weekly, checking for poisonous plants, monitoring water quality, ensuring that everything that went into his horses was exactly what it should be. Ethan had let that routine slip, too overwhelmed by grief and responsibility, too focused on the business side of things, the bank, the creditors, the endless paperwork. He'd trusted that the land was what it had always been, never thinking that something might have changed. That mistake had cost 6 horses their lives, maybe 7 by morning. The bowl was empty. Ethan didn't remember eating. He set it in the sink and stood there for a long moment, hands braced on the counter, head bowed. "Mr. Crowley?" He turned to find Clara standing in the kitchen doorway. She'd washed her face and hands, changed into a plain cotton dress that was only slightly less worn than her traveling clothes. Her hair was still pulled back severely, but a few dark strands had escaped to frame her face. She looked exhausted, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from long travel and longer worry. "Your stew is there," Ethan said, gesturing to the table. "I can heat it up if it's gone cold." "It's fine." Clara sat down and began eating with the same efficient practicality she'd shown examining Duchess. "I'll need to borrow clothes in the morning, something practical for field work. I don't suppose you have anything that might fit?" "My mother's things are still in a trunk upstairs. She was about your height." "That will work." They fell into silence, Clara eating and Ethan watching the darkness settle over the ranch. Somewhere out there, Jimmy was keeping vigil. Somewhere out there, 6 horses were standing in a pasture, unaware that they'd been sentenced to starvation rations until Clara could determine whether the grass beneath their hooves was trying to kill them. "Why did you come?" Ethan asked finally. "After my letter. After knowing what you were walking into. Why come at all?" Clara finished chewing, swallowed, and set down her spoon with deliberate care. "Because I made a promise. And because I've spent most of my life watching people give up the moment things get difficult." She met his eyes across the kitchen table. "I didn't cross a continent to give up. And I won't start now. You don't owe me anything. The contract was with my father. The contract was for a home and a future. Your father's death doesn't void that unless you're telling me you won't honor it." "I'm telling you there might not be a home or a future to honor. The bank can wait." Clara's voice was firm. "First we solve the immediate problem. We save the horses that can be saved. Then we deal with everything else." "You sound very certain." "I am certain. I've solved worse problems with fewer resources." She pushed her bowl away, the stew half finished. "I was married to a veterinarian for 6 years, Mr. Crowley. He died of typhoid, left me with debts and no prospects. I spent 2 years working as a nurse in Philadelphia's charity hospital to pay off what he owed and learn enough to support myself. I've seen more sickness, death, and suffering than you can imagine. I've learned to recognize patterns, to trust my judgment, and to act when others are still deliberating. She stood, picking up her bowl and carrying it to the sink. This ranch is dying because something is poisoning it from within. That's a problem I know how to solve. The question is whether you're ready to trust me enough to let me try. Ethan studied her in the dim kitchen light. This woman who'd appeared like something out of a fever dream, walking into disaster with her spine straight and her eyes clear. This stranger who seemed to see solutions where he saw only endings. If you're wrong, he started, then we'll be no worse off than we are now. Clara dried her hands on a towel. But if I'm right, and we do nothing, you'll lose the last 6 horses. The bank will foreclose, and everything your father built will belong to someone else by next spring. She was right. Ethan knew she was right. The bank's final letter sat in his desk drawer, giving him 60 days to make a substantial payment or lose the property. He had 43 days left and no way to raise the money without horses to sell, and he couldn't sell horses that were dead. First light, he said. We checked the south field. Clara nodded. First light. She moved toward the hallway, then paused. Your stable hand. Jimmy? He's loyal to you? He's a good kid. His father worked for mine. He'd die before he'd hurt this ranch. Good. We'll need help. This isn't going to be easy, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. She looked at him steadily. You should prepare yourself for that. It's already as bad as it can get. No, Mr. Crowley, it's not. Claire's expression was unreadable. But we'll face it together. That's what the contract says, after all, for better or worse. She disappeared into the hallway, leaving Ethan alone in the kitchen with those words echoing in his mind. For better or worse. The traditional marriage vow, spoken about a contract that was supposed to be purely business. No romance, no illusions, just 2 people facing impossible odds together. Outside, Jimmy's lantern went dark. Duchess was gone. Ethan extinguished the kitchen lamp and stood in the darkness, listening to the old house settle around him. Somewhere above, Clara Whitmore was sleeping in his mother's old room, preparing to throw herself into a fight that wasn't hers to fight. And tomorrow, they would walk into the south field together and search for the thing that was destroying everything he had left. If she was right, if there was something toxic hidden in that innocent-looking grass, then maybe there was hope. Maybe the surviving horses could be saved. Maybe the ranch could survive long enough for him to find a way to pay the bank. If she was wrong, he'd be burying 6 more horses before the month was out. Ethan climbed the stairs to his own room, but he didn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching the stars wheel overhead, waiting for dawn and whatever truth it would bring. In the darkness, the south field lay quiet and still, holding its secrets close. Dawn came cold and gray, the kind of morning that promised nothing good. Ethan had watched it arrive from his bedroom window, tracking the slow transformation of black sky to charcoal to the pale, sickly light that now filtered through the kitchen as he stood over the stove, frying eggs he had no appetite for. Clara appeared in the doorway at 5:30, dressed in his mother's old work clothes, canvas pants that had been rolled at the cuffs, and a worn flannel shirt that hung loose on her frame. She'd braided her hair into a single plait that hung down her back, severe and practical. In the morning light, she looked younger somehow, though her eyes held the same hard certainty they'd shown the night before. Duchess? She asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Jimmy buried her before midnight, 8th grave in 3 weeks. Ethan slid eggs onto 2 plates, added bread he'd toasted over the stove. Coffee's ready. They ate in silence, the scrape of forks against tin plates, the only sound in the kitchen. Through the window, Ethan could see the south field stretching away into the distance, innocent and deadly in the pale morning light. Jimmy was already out there, a small figure moving along the fence line, checking on the surviving horses. Clara finished first, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, and stood. We'll need bags, canvas, preferably, something we can use to collect samples. There's feed sacks in the barn. Good, and gloves, heavy ones. If there's something toxic out there, I don't want to handle it with bare skin. Ethan led her across the yard to the barn, their boots crunching on frost-stiffened grass. The morning air bit at exposed skin, carrying the scent of horses and hay and the faint underlying smell of turned earth from Duchess's fresh grave. Jimmy saw them coming and jogged over, his young face drawn with exhaustion and grief. "Mr. Crowley, ma'am." He nodded to Clara, curiosity and wariness mixing in his expression. "The six are doing fine. No symptoms. Been watching them all night." "You should get some sleep," Ethan said. "I'm all right. What are we doing?" "Surveying the south field." Clara's voice was brisk, brooking no argument. "Looking for anything unusual. Plants that don't belong. Areas where the grass looks different. Any signs of contamination." Jimmy's eyes widened slightly. "You think something's growing out there? Something that killed them?" "I think something killed them, and the south field is where it started." Clara pulled on the heavy leather gloves Ethan handed her. "You know this land?" "Worked it since I was 12, ma'am. My pa before me." "Then you'll know if you see something that shouldn't be there." She grabbed 2 canvas sacks from the pile near the barn door. "We walk in a grid pattern, slow and methodical. Every inch gets examined. Anything suspicious gets bagged and tagged with location markers." They set out across the south field, 3 figures spread in a line, moving through grass that came up to their knees in places. The field was roughly 40 acres, gently rolling terrain that caught the morning sun and held it, creating a microclimate slightly warmer than the surrounding pastures. That was why the grass stayed green longer, why Thomas Crowley had always saved it for late-season grazing when other fields had gone brown and sparse. Ethan had walked this field countless times, had helped his father mend the fences that bordered it, had ridden through it on horseback, had stood at its edge and watched horses graze contentedly under summer skies. It looked exactly as it always had, peaceful, pastoral, unremarkable in every way. But Clara moved through it like a soldier clearing hostile territory, eyes scanning every square foot of ground, occasionally dropping to her knees to examine something more closely. Jimmy followed her lead, his younger eyes sharp and focused. Ethan felt useless by comparison, seeing only grass and clover and the occasional wildflower, nothing that screamed danger or death. An hour passed, then 2. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning chill but bringing no warmth to the work. Ethan's back ached from bending, his eyes watered from the strain of searching for something he couldn't identify. He was about to suggest they take a break when Clara's voice cut through the morning air. "Here!" The single word carried complete certainty. Ethan and Jimmy hurried over to where Clara knelt in a slight depression near the western edge of the field, her gloved hands hovering over a cluster of plants that looked, to Ethan's untrained eye, like every other plant in the vicinity. "What is it?" Jimmy asked, crouching beside her. Clara didn't answer immediately. She was examining the plants with intense focus, her fingers gently lifting leaves, checking stems, studying the root structure where it emerged from the soil. Finally, she sat back on her heels and looked up at Ethan with an expression that mixed vindication with something darker. "Water hemlock," she said quietly. "Cicuta maculata, one of the most poisonous plants in North America." The name meant nothing to Ethan. "I've never heard of it." Most people haven't unless they've had reason to learn about poisonous plants. It grows near water in marshy areas. Looks similar to wild carrot or parsnip. Clara pointed to a cluster growing about 10 feet away. "See how it's concentrated here in this low spot where water probably pools after rain?" Ethan looked and saw what she meant. The depression would naturally collect runoff from the higher ground, creating a wet area that would stay moist longer than the surrounding field. Perfect conditions for a water-loving plant. "My father knew every plant on this property," Ethan said, but doubt had crept into his voice. "He would have seen this." "Maybe he did, years ago, and cleared it out. Maybe it's spread since then. Maybe it was always here in small numbers, not enough to matter when horses only grazed this field occasionally." Clara stood, brushing dirt from her knees. "But you started using this pasture regularly, didn't you, after your father died? I told you last night, early August, you wanted to give them the best grass while you dealt with everything else. I remember." Clara's tone held no judgment, just stating facts. "So the horses spent weeks here, grazing every day, and every day some of them ate a little bit of this." She gestured to the hemlock. "Not enough to kill them immediately, not even enough to make them noticeably sick at first, but it accumulated. built up in their systems, and eventually it reached toxic levels. Jimmy had gone pale. All this time we've been poisoning them ourselves? You didn't know. Clara began carefully collecting samples of the hemlock, placing them in her canvas sack with methodical precision. And the symptoms probably didn't start immediately. By the time you noticed something was wrong, they'd already consumed a lethal dose. Ethan felt sick. 6 horses dead because he tried to do the right thing, tried to give them the best care while he struggled to keep the ranch afloat. The irony was brutal. In attempting to preserve his father's legacy, he destroyed it more effectively than simple neglect ever could have. What do we do? His voice came out rough, strained. The 6 that are left, they grazed here too. Are they going to die anyway? Not if they didn't consume enough to reach lethal levels, and not if we act quickly. Clara tied off her sample bag and stood. We need to walk the entire field, map every cluster of hemlock. Then we need to remove it, all of it, root and stem, and the horses can never graze here again, not until we're certain it's completely gone. That could take months, Jimmy said, maybe years. Then it takes months, or years. Clara's expression was implacable. But first, we need to make sure the surviving horses flush the poison from their systems before it kills them too. How? Ethan asked. Activated charcoal. Fluids. Careful monitoring. I'll need supplies from town. She met his eyes. And I'll need you to trust that I know what I'm doing. Trust. Such a simple word for such an enormous ask. Ethan looked at this woman he'd known for less than 24 hours, who'd walked into his disaster and immediately started issuing orders like she had every right to do so. Every instinct told him to be cautious, to question, to verify her claims with someone more qualified. But the 6 horses standing in the near pasture were running out of time, and Clara Whitmore had found in 3 hours what the veterinarian had missed in 3 weeks. What do you need from town? He asked. Clara's shoulders relaxed fractionally, a tension he hadn't noticed easing. Activated charcoal, as much as they have, electrolyte powders, clean syringes, cotton gauze, and I'll need to speak with the pharmacist directly. There are other compounds that might help, but I'll need to know what he has in stock. Miller's General Store has most of that. Doc Henshaw might have the rest. Then we go to town. Now. The longer we wait, the worse their chances. She turned to Jimmy. You stay here. Map every hemlock cluster you can find. Mark them with stakes so we know where to clear. And keep the horses away from this field. Hay and grain only until further notice. Jimmy nodded, already moving to follow her instructions. Ethan marveled at how quickly the young man had accepted Clara's authority, how naturally she'd assumed command of a situation that by all rights should have been Ethan's to control. They walked back to the house in silence. Ethan hitched his father's old wagon, while Clara changed back into traveling clothes, emerging 10 minutes later looking every inch the proper Philadelphia widow. The transformation was startling. Gone was the woman who'd knelt in dirt and handled poison plants, replaced by someone who could walk into Miller's General Store without raising eyebrows. The ride into town took 40 minutes, the wagon wheels cutting through muddy ruts left by recent rain. Neither of them spoke much. Ethan was lost in calculations, trying to figure out how much the supplies would cost, how much credit he still had at Miller's, whether Doc Henshaw would extend him any more debt. Clara sat beside him, straight-backed and composed, watching the Montana landscape roll past with unreadable eyes. Twisted Pine wasn't much of a town, maybe 300 people on a good day, scattered across a main street and a handful of side roads. Miller's General Store occupied the largest building, a 2-story structure that served as supply depot, post office, and social hub. The saloon next door provided entertainment. The church on the hill provided salvation. Everything else was houses and hope. Ethan pulled the wagon up in front of Miller's and helped Clara down, acutely aware of the eyes watching from windows and doorways. News traveled fast in small towns, and his arrival with a strange woman would be all over Twisted Pine by lunchtime. The bell above the door chimed as they entered. Walter Miller looked up from behind the counter, his weathered face creasing into a smile that died as soon as he recognized Ethan. Ethan. The greeting was cautious, reserved. Heard about another horse. Sorry for your trouble. Thanks, Walter. Ethan gestured to Clara. This is Clara Whitmore. He fumbled for words, unsure how to explain a contract marriage to a man who'd known his family for 30 years. "I'm Mr. Crowley's intended," Clara said smoothly, extending her hand with perfect propriety. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Mr. Miller." Walter's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline, but he shook her hand with automatic courtesy. "Ma'am, didn't know Ethan was courting." "It was arranged by his late father. I've only just arrived from Philadelphia." Clara's smile was polite, distant, revealing nothing. "We need supplies. Quite a lot, I'm afraid. Do you have activated charcoal in stock?" The question clearly caught Walter off guard. "Charcoal? I've got some for filtering water. Why would you—" "I'll need all you have. Also electrolyte powders, clean syringes, cotton gauze, and anything else you'd recommend for treating poisoning in horses." Walter's expression shifted from confusion to suspicion. "The horses are poisoned?" "Water hemlock," Claire said crisply. "Growing in the south pasture. We're treating the survivors to flush their systems before it kills them too." The store had gone quiet. Ethan became aware of other customers: Martha Hendricks near the fabric bolts, Tom Chen examining seed packets, Sarah Morrison with her 2 children near the candy jars, all listening with naked curiosity. "Water hemlock," Walter repeated slowly. "You're sure?" "Completely certain. I identified it this morning." Clara's tone suggested that questioning her judgment was both foolish and pointless. "Now the supplies. Time is rather important." Walter glanced at Ethan, clearly seeking confirmation or explanation. Ethan nodded once, sharp and definite. "Give her what she needs, Walter. Put it on my account." Something complicated crossed Walter's face. "Ethan, I don't know if I can extend any more credit. You're already carrying a balance that—" "I'm aware of what I owe." Ethan's voice came out harder than he intended. "But those 6 horses are all I have left to sell. If they die, I can't pay you anything. If they live, I can sell them and clear my debts. So it's in your interest to extend the credit." The logic was brutal but sound. Walter's jaw worked as he considered, clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation. Finally, he nodded. "All right. But this is the last time, Ethan. After this, it's cash only." "Understood." Walter began pulling supplies from shelves and drawers, muttering under his breath about the foolishness of young people and their wild ideas. Clara supervised with eagle-eyed attention, checking quantities and quality, rejecting anything that didn't meet her standards. The other customers had abandoned all pretense of shopping, openly staring now. Martha Hendricks broke the silence first. "You really think it's poison, not disease?" Clara turned to face the older woman, her expression patient but firm. "I'm certain. Water hemlock poisoning presents with very specific symptoms: rapid onset, neurological damage, respiratory distress, and distinctive chemical odor in the saliva. I've seen it before, in livestock cases back east." "And you can cure them?" This from Tom Chen, moving closer with obvious interest. "The horses that aren't sick yet?" "If we act quickly enough, yes. The poison can be flushed from their systems with aggressive treatment, but it requires immediate intervention." Sarah Morrison spoke up, her children pressed against her skirts. "My husband works at the Brennan Ranch. They've got horses grazing near water. Should they be worried?" "Only if they have water hemlock growing in their pastures. It's distinctive once you know what to look for. Hollow stems with purple streaks, white flowers in umbrella clusters, roots that smell like carrots or parsnips. If you're unsure, have someone who knows plants check the area." The conversation was taking on a life of its own, other customers peppering Clara with questions about symptoms, prevention, treatment. She answered each one with calm authority, never condescending but never uncertain. Ethan watched her handle the room with growing amazement. This was a woman who'd arrived in town 30 minutes ago, who'd walked into a store full of strangers and immediately commanded their attention and respect. Walter finished assembling the supplies, calculating the total with obvious reluctance. "Comes to $47.30, he said quietly. "That's with my cost on most of it. No markup." $47. Nearly a tenth of what Ethan owed the bank, and more than he'd spent on supplies in the last 2 months. But Clara was right. If the horses died, the debt wouldn't matter anyway. Everything would be gone. "Put it on the account," Ethan said. They loaded the supplies into the wagon, Clara directing the placement of fragile items with the same meticulous care she'd shown collecting hemlock samples. As they worked, Ethan noticed Robert Brennan watching from across the street, his expression dark and calculating. Brennan owned the largest ranch in the area, had made multiple offers to buy the Crowley property over the years. Thomas had always refused, and Ethan had continued that refusal despite the mounting pressure. Brennan crossed the street as they finished loading, his expensive boots leaving clean prints in the muddy road. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and well-fed, wearing success like a second skin. "Ethan," he said, nodding curtly, "heard about your troubles. Shame about the horses. Thank you for your concern, Robert. I also heard you're treating the survivors with some experimental cure?" Brennan's eyes flicked to Clara, assessment and dismissal in a single glance. "Seems risky, given your situation." "The risk is doing nothing." Ethan kept his voice level, refusing to rise to the bait. "We identified the problem. Now we're solving it." "We?" Brennan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "And who exactly is this we? Your new Philadelphia bride, fresh off the train, who thinks she knows Montana ranching better than people who've lived here their whole lives?" Clara stepped forward before Ethan could respond, extending her hand with the same cool propriety she'd shown Walter Miller. "Clara Whitmore. And I don't claim to know Montana ranching, Mr. Brennan, but I do know poisonous plants, and I do know veterinary medicine. My late husband was a veterinarian. I worked alongside him for 6 years before his death." Brennan ignored her outstretched hand. "Book learning doesn't translate to practical knowledge. You might have read about water hemlock in some Philadelphia textbook, but that doesn't mean you can recognize it in a real pasture or treat real animals with real lives at stake." "The horses are already dying," Clara said quietly, dropping her hand. "Doing nothing guarantees they'll all be dead within weeks. Attempting treatment gives them a chance at survival. The mathematics seem quite simple to me." "The mathematics of what? Throwing good money after bad? Extending credit you can't repay?" Brennan turned back to Ethan. "My offer still stands. $40,000 for the property, as is. That's more than enough to clear your debts and give you a fresh start somewhere else. Somewhere that doesn't hold so many painful memories." 40,000. It was a fair price, maybe even generous given the circumstances. Enough to pay the bank, settle accounts in town, and leave with a modest stake for starting over. Brennan had made the same offer 3 times since Thomas's death, each time with the same reasonable tone, the same logical arguments. And each time, Ethan had refused. Because selling meant admitting defeat, meant walking away from everything his father had built, everything Thomas Crowley had poured 30 years of sweat and blood into creating. Meant letting the legacy die on his watch. "The answer is still no, Robert." Brennan's expression hardened. "Pride is expensive, Ethan. More expensive than you can afford right now. You're gambling with money you don't have on a cure that probably won't work, advised by a woman with no practical experience and no stake in the outcome. When this fails, and it will fail, you'll lose everything. The bank will foreclose, and you'll get nothing. Whereas my offer puts money in your pocket and gives you options. Or it gives you the Crowley Ranch at a fraction of its real value." Clara's voice cut through Brennan's speech like a knife. 40,000 for 200 acres of prime grazing land, established infrastructure, and proximity to town. That's $200 an acre. I may be new to Montana, Mr. Brennan, but even I know that's significantly below market value for developed ranch property. Brennan's eyes narrowed. "The property is compromised. Poisoned pastures, dead livestock, debts piling up. That affects value considerably. Poisoned pastures can be cleared. Dead livestock can be replaced. Debts can be repaid once the immediate crisis is resolved." Clara stepped closer, and Ethan was struck by how small she looked next to Brennan's bulk, and how utterly unbothered she seemed by the size difference. "What's really affecting value here is desperation. You're betting that Mr. Crowley will become desperate enough to accept an unfair offer, and you're hoping that I, as a newcomer, won't realize just how unfair it is." Brennan's face flushed red. "You've got a sharp tongue for someone who just arrived. Might want to watch it before you make enemies you can't afford." "I didn't come here to make friends, Mr. Brennan. I came to honor a commitment and help preserve something worth preserving." Clara turned to Ethan. "We should go. The horses need treatment, and we're wasting time." Ethan climbed onto the wagon bench, offering Clara his hand to help her up. She took it with quiet dignity, settling beside him as he gathered the reins. Before they pulled away, Brennan spoke again, his voice carrying across the street. "When this fails, Ethan, don't come crying to me for help. My offer won't stand forever." Ethan didn't bother responding. He flicked the reins and the wagon lurched into motion, leaving Brennan standing in the muddy street with anger written across his face. They were halfway back to the ranch before Clara spoke. "He'll try to sabotage us." "What?" Ethan glanced at her, startled. "Mr. Brennan, he has too much invested in your failure to let us succeed peacefully." Clara stared straight ahead, her voice matter of fact. "He's been positioning himself to buy your property cheaply. If we prove the ranch can recover, his opportunity disappears. He'll find ways to undermine our efforts. Robert's ruthless, but he's not criminal. He won't he?" Clara turned to look at Ethan directly. "He's offering you $40,000 for property worth 3 or 4 times that amount. That's not generosity, Mr. Crowley. That's opportunism. And opportunists don't sit idle when their opportunities are threatened." Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to defend his neighbor and longtime business associate. But Clara's logic was uncomfortably sound. Brennan had been circling the Crowley ranch like a vulture for months, waiting for the final collapse. Now that collapse was being delayed, possibly prevented, by a stranger with sharp eyes and sharper instincts. "Let him try," Ethan said finally. "We've got enough to worry about without borrowing trouble." Clara nodded, apparently satisfied with that response. They rode the rest of the way in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Back at the ranch, Jimmy had marked 17 clusters of water hemlock spread across the south field. He'd also moved the 6 surviving horses to a small paddock near the barn, where they could be watched constantly and prevented from grazing anything except the hay Clara approved. What followed was 3 days of brutal, exhausting work. Clara treated each horse individually, forcing activated charcoal down their throats, monitoring their vital signs, adjusting dosages based on weight and symptom severity. She slept in the barn, refused to leave them for more than necessary minutes. Ethan and Jimmy worked in shifts, following her instructions with mechanical precision, trusting her judgment because they had no choice and no alternative. The first horse to show improvement was Dancer, a young mare that had only grazed the south field for a few days. Her appetite returned on the second day of treatment, her eyes clearing, her movements becoming less labored. Clara allowed herself a small nod of satisfaction, but no celebration. The second was Copper, an older gelding with a temperament like granite. He fought the treatment initially, requiring 3 people to hold him still while Clara administered the charcoal. But by day 3, he was eating again, nickering softly when Clara approached with food. The others followed over the next week. Slowly, incrementally, they began to recover. Not all at once, not dramatically, but with steady, measurable improvement that Clara documented in a notebook she'd started keeping. Every temperature, every symptom, every behavioral change got recorded in her precise handwriting. News spread through Twisted Pine like wildfire. The Crowley horses were recovering. The strange woman from Philadelphia had actually done it, identified a poison the local vet had missed, and treated it successfully. Some people were impressed. Others were suspicious. A few were outright hostile, spreading rumors that Clara was a charlatan who'd gotten lucky, that the horses would relapse any day now, that the whole thing was smoke and mirrors designed to fool creditors and delay the inevitable foreclosure. Brennan was conspicuously silent, but Ethan caught sight of him twice, driving slowly past the ranch entrance, watching with hooded eyes. On the 8th day after Clara's arrival, all 6 horses were eating normally, moving freely, showing no signs of poisoning. Clara stood in the paddock at sunset, watching them graze on clean hay, her expression finally showing something that might have been relief. "They're going to make it," Ethan said, joining her at the fence. "They're going to make it," Clara agreed, "though they'll need careful monitoring for another month at least, and the south field needs to be completely cleared of hemlock before any animal grazes there again. Jimmy and I can handle that. You've done enough." Clara turned to look at him, and in the fading light, Ethan saw exhaustion etched into every line of her face. She'd driven herself relentlessly for over a week, sleeping maybe 3 hours a night, eating when forced, focusing every ounce of will on keeping those 6 horses alive. "We need to talk about what comes next," she said quietly. "Next?" "The bank. Your debts." The ranch's future. Clara gestured to the horses. Saving 6 animals doesn't solve your financial problems. You still owe money you can't pay, and the deadline is still approaching. Ethan had been trying not to think about that, focusing instead on the immediate crisis. But Clara was right. Saving the horses was only the first step. Now he had to figure out how to save everything else. I'll sell them, he said. All 6. Should bring enough to make a substantial payment to the bank, buy some time. Sell them to whom? Every rancher in the area knows your situation. They'll lowball you, knowing you're desperate. Then what do you suggest? Clara was quiet for a long moment, watching the horses move in the gathering darkness. When she spoke, her voice carried a certainty that made Ethan's chest tighten. We bet on me. What? Word is spreading about the treatment. People are talking, wondering if their own livestock might be affected by plants they don't recognize, wanting someone who can identify problems their regular veterinarians miss. Clara met his eyes. I can do that. I can build a practice here, treating animals, consulting on pasture safety, diagnosing conditions others can't. But I need capital to start. Need supplies, need credibility, need time to establish myself. You want to use the horses as collateral? Risk them on starting a business? I want to use them as proof of concept. Keep 1 or 2 to show potential clients, living evidence that my methods work. Sell the rest to fund initial operations and make a payment to the bank. Claire's expression was intense, focused. We gamble that I can build something fast enough to generate income before the bank's deadline. It's a risk, but it's a better risk than selling everything and hoping it's enough. Ethan stared at her, this woman who'd walked into his dying ranch and turned it into something that might have a future. She was asking him to bet everything, the last horses, the remaining time, the final scraps of his father's legacy, on her ability to build a veterinary practice from nothing in a town that was already suspicious of her. It was insane, reckless, the kind of gamble his father would never have made. But his father had also never watched 6 horses die in 3 weeks, had never stood on the edge of total collapse, watching everything he'd built crumble into dust. How much time do we have? Ethan asked. 36 days until the bank's deadline, less if they decide to move early. Clara's voice was steady, betraying no doubt. It's enough, barely, but enough. Ethan looked at the 6 horses, healthy and alive against all odds. Looked at Clara, standing straight-backed and certain in the fading light. Looked at the ranch that had been his whole life, teetering on the edge of extinction. All right, he said, we bet on you. Clara's hand found his in the darkness, squeezed once, then released. Then we start tomorrow, and we don't stop until we've won. The first client arrived 3 days later, driving a wagon with a limping gelding tied behind it. Ethan was in the barn repairing tack when he heard the wheels crunching across the yard, looked up to see Tom Chen climbing down with the careful movements of a man who'd been driving for hours. Mr. Chen! Ethan set down the leather strap he'd been working on, wiped his hands on his pants. What brings you out here? Tom gestured to the horse, a handsome bay with one front leg held gingerly off the ground. Been lame for 2 weeks. Doc Henshaw looked at him, couldn't find anything, said to rest him. But he's not getting better, and I need him for spring plowing. He paused, looking uncomfortable. Heard your wife knows about animals. Thought maybe she could take a look. Clara appeared in the barn doorway as if summoned, still wearing the work clothes she'd adopted as her uniform. She'd been spending every morning clearing hemlock from the south field, brutal work that left her hands blistered despite the heavy gloves. But she approached Tom's gelding with the same focused attention she gave everything else. How long has he been favoring that leg? She asked, running her hands down the horse's shoulder, feeling for heat or swelling. Started about 2 weeks ago. Came up lame after a day in the fields. Tom watched her work with obvious skepticism mixed with desperate hope. Figured he'd stepped on something, but I checked the hoof. Nothing there. Clara worked in silence, her hands moving systematically up and down the leg, pressing, probing, checking every joint and tendon. The gelding stood patient under her examination, ears flicking back and forth. Finally, she knelt and lifted the hoof again, this time examining not just the bottom, but the entire structure, running her fingers along the wall where it met the coronet band. There, she said quietly, pointing to a spot Ethan couldn't see from where he stood. Abscess. It's migrated up into the hoof wall. That's why Doc Henshaw couldn't find anything on initial examination. It wasn't visible yet. Can you fix it? Tom's voice was tight with worry. I can drain it. The horse will need to be kept in a clean stall for a week, the hoof soaked twice daily in warm water with Epsom salts. After draining, I'll pack it with icthamol to draw out any remaining infection. Clara stood, meeting Tom's eyes directly. He'll be sound again in 10 days, maybe 2 weeks. But you can't work him during treatment, or the infection will spread and you'll lose the hoof entirely. Tom's shoulders sagged with relief. What do you charge? Clara glanced at Ethan, and he saw the calculation in her eyes. This was the moment. Set the price too high, and word would spread that she was gouging desperate ranchers. Set it too low, and she'd never generate enough income to matter. $5 for the drainage and initial treatment, Clara said. $2 for the medication you'll need to take home. I'll provide written instructions for the soaking protocol. If there are complications, additional visits will be $3 each. $7 total. More than Doc Henshaw charged for a standard visit, but less than a replacement horse would cost. Tom considered for a moment, then nodded. Done. When can you do it? Now, if you can wait, the sooner we drain it, the faster he'll recover. What followed was a demonstration of skill that left both Ethan and Tom watching with something close to awe. Clara worked with calm precision, talking to the gelding in a low, steady voice as she cleaned the hoof, identified the exact location of the abscess, and made a careful incision that released a stream of foul-smelling pus. The horse flinched but didn't pull away, seeming to understand that she was helping rather than hurting. She drained the abscess completely, flushed it with an antiseptic solution she'd mixed herself, then packed it with the black drawing salve and wrapped the entire hoof in clean bandaging. The whole process took maybe 20 minutes, but by the time she finished, the gelding was already standing more comfortably, less weight on the injured leg. Keep that bandage clean and dry, Clara instructed, washing her hands in a bucket of water Jimmy had brought. Change it every other day. Soak the hoof morning and evening. If you see red streaking up the leg or if he develops a fever, send for me immediately. Otherwise, I'll check on him in a week. Tom counted out $7 in coins, handed them to Clara with something like reverence in his expression. Thank you, ma'am. Really, I was afraid I'd have to put him down. He's a good horse. Worth saving. Clara pocketed the money, the first payment for services she'd rendered on her own authority. Take care of him, and he'll take care of you. Tom drove away an hour later, the gelding moving more easily already. Ethan watched the wagon disappear down the road, then turned to find Clara staring at the coins in her palm with an unreadable expression. $7, she said quietly. 36 days to make thousands. This won't be enough. It's a start. Ethan moved closer, saw the tension in her shoulders that she'd hidden from Tom Chen. Word will spread. People will come. If they believe the treatment works, if Tom's horse recovers, if Brennan doesn't convince everyone I'm a fraud. Clara closed her fist around the coins. Too many ifs. But 2 days later, Sarah Morrison arrived with a cow that had stopped giving milk. Clara diagnosed a mineral deficiency, prescribed a supplement regimen, charged $4. The cow's production returned within a week. 3 days after that, a rancher from the next county over brought a mare with chronic colic. Clara identified an intestinal obstruction that would have killed the animal within days, treated it successfully, charged $10 for the emergency intervention. Word spread like ripples across a pond. The strange woman at the Crowley Ranch who could diagnose problems other people missed, who worked with quiet confidence and demanded payment but delivered results, who didn't make promises she couldn't keep but also didn't give up when things got difficult. Clients started arriving with increasing frequency. Some came from Twisted Pine, neighbors who'd watched Clara save the Crowley horses and decided to trust her with their own animals. Others traveled from surrounding areas, drawn by stories that grew more elaborate with each retelling. The Philadelphia widow who'd studied veterinary medicine with her husband, who knew plants and poisons and treatments the local doctors had never heard of, who charged fair prices and told you the truth, even when the truth was hard to hear. Clara treated them all with the same methodical attention. Cattle with foot rot, horses with respiratory infections, sheep with parasites, a dog that had eaten something toxic and needed emergency treatment. Each case was documented in her growing notebook, each success adding to her reputation, each payment going into a wooden box she kept locked in Ethan's office. By the end of the second week, she'd earned $43. By the end of the third, $87. The numbers climbed, but never fast enough, the bank's deadline approaching like a storm on the horizon. Ethan sold 4 of the 6 surviving horses to a buyer from Helena who'd heard about the recovery and wanted to see the animals for himself. He'd driven out expecting to find broken-down nags barely clinging to life. Instead found healthy, well-muscled horses with clear eyes and good temperaments. He paid top dollar, $600 for 4 horses, more than Ethan had dared hope for. Combined with Clara's earnings, they had enough to make a substantial payment to the bank. Not enough to clear the debt entirely, but enough to buy time, to prove they were serious about recovery, to negotiate an extension on the final deadline. Ethan made the trip to town alone, carrying the money in a leather pouch that felt simultaneously heavy and insufficient. The bank manager, a thin man named Frederick Walsh with spectacles and a permanent expression of disapproval, counted the bills twice before looking up. $687, Walsh said. This doesn't even cover half of what you owe, Mr. Crowley. I know, but it's a good faith payment, proof that the ranch is recovering, that we can generate income. Ethan kept his voice level, refusing to show the desperation clawing at his chest. I'm requesting an extension on the final deadline. Another 60 days. Walsh sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers. The bank has been extraordinarily patient with your situation. Your father was a valued client, and we've extended considerable leeway out of respect for his memory. But patience has limits, Mr. Crowley. We can't continue indefinitely. I'm not asking for indefinitely, just 60 more days. My wife has established a veterinary practice. She's generating steady income, building a client base. Given time, we can pay off the entire debt and restore the ranch to profitability. Your wife? Walsh's tone suggested he'd heard all about Clara and found the entire situation irregular. The woman from Philadelphia who arrived under somewhat unusual circumstances. I've heard the talk, Mr. Crowley. Some people think she's a miracle worker. Others think she's a charlatan who got lucky a few times and will be exposed soon enough. The people who matter, her clients, know she delivers results. That's all that should concern the bank. Walsh pulled out a ledger, ran his finger down a column of numbers. Even if I were inclined to grant an extension, I'd need approval from the board. And the board will want assurances, guarantees that this isn't just delaying the inevitable. What kind of guarantees? Continued payments, proof of ongoing income. Perhaps a business plan demonstrating how you intend to achieve full repayment within the extended time frame. Walsh looked up, his expression softening slightly. I'm not unsympathetic to your situation, Ethan. I knew your father, respected him, but I have responsibilities to the bank, and right now your account represents a significant risk. Ethan left the bank with a provisional agreement, 60 days extension, contingent on making weekly payments of at least $50 and providing documentation of Clara's practice earnings. It wasn't ideal, but it was survival. One more reprieve from total collapse. He was halfway back to the ranch when he saw smoke, black smoke, thick and oily, rising from the direction of his property. Ethan's heart seized in his chest. He whipped the horses into a gallop, the wagon bouncing dangerously over ruts and rocks, every second an eternity of terrible possibilities. The barn, the house, the paddock where Clara kept the remaining 2 horses, and the animals currently under treatment. He crested the final hill and saw flames licking at the eastern paddock fence, smoke billowing from burning hay bales stacked near the water troughs. Jimmy and Clara were already fighting the fire, hauling buckets from the well, throwing water at flames that seemed to laugh at their efforts. Ethan abandoned the wagon and ran, grabbing buckets, joining the desperate battle against fire that had no business starting on its own in late autumn, with everything still damp from recent rain. The horses were screaming, panicked by smoke and flames, throwing themselves against paddock gates in their terror to escape. "Get the animals out!" Clara shouted over the roar of fire. Her face was streaked with soot, her hands raw from rope burns. "The fence won't hold if they panic." Ethan and Jimmy worked together, opening gates, herding terrified horses away from the flames toward the far pasture. A cow Clara had been treating for mastitis bolted past them, eyes rolling white with fear. 2 sheep ran in circles, bleating frantically. It took an hour to contain the fire, Another hour to fully extinguish it. By the time the last ember died, the eastern paddock was destroyed. Fence posts blackened and collapsed, hay bales reduced to smoking ash, the water troughs cracked from heat. 2 animals were injured, burned when embers caught their coats before they could be moved. Nothing fatal, but painful and requiring treatment they couldn't afford to delay. Clara worked on the injured animals with hands that shook from exhaustion and adrenaline, cleaning burns, applying salve, talking in that low, steady voice that seemed to calm even the most frightened creatures. Ethan and Jimmy surveyed the damage, calculating costs that made Ethan's stomach turn. "How did this start?" Jimmy asked, kicking at the remains of a hay bale. "Everything's been wet for days. Nothing should have caught fire." Ethan knelt, examining the burned area more carefully. That's when he saw it. The remnants of what looked like a lantern. The glass shattered, the metal frame twisted from heat. A lantern that had no business being near the hay bales, in a paddock they hadn't used for storage in weeks. "Someone set this," Ethan said quietly. The certainty in his voice made Jimmy go pale. Deliberately. Clara appeared at his shoulder, saw what he was looking at. Her expression went cold and hard, all the exhaustion draining away, replaced by something that looked like fury tempered into steel. "Brennan," she said. Not a question. "We don't know that." But even as Ethan said it, he knew she was right. The timing was too perfect. Right after he'd made a payment to the bank, right when Clara's practice was gaining momentum, right when recovery seemed possible instead of hopeless. Who else benefits from our failure? Who else has been circling like a vulture, waiting for the final collapse? Clara's voice was quiet but venomous. This was meant to destroy our credibility. Kill the animals we're treating. Prove that I can't protect livestock, that my practice is a fraud, that you should sell to him while you still can. We can't prove it was him. We don't need to prove it to him. We need to prove it to everyone else. Clara turned to survey the damage, her mind clearly working through implications and responses. He's made a mistake. He's shown his hand too early, and he's underestimated what we're willing to do to survive. Ethan wanted to ask what she meant, but Jimmy interrupted, pointing toward the road. "Someone's coming." A wagon approached, moving fast. As it got closer, Ethan recognized Martha Hendricks from the general store, her face flushed with exertion and worry. She pulled up in a cloud of dust, nearly falling in her haste to climb down. "Mrs. Crowley, thank goodness you're here. It's my husband's prize bull. He's down and we can't get him up. Started this morning, and Doc Henshaw says there's nothing to be done, but I thought maybe—" She broke off, seeing the burned paddock, the injured animals, the soot-stained exhaustion on their faces. "Oh Lord, what happened?" "Fire," Clara said shortly. "We contained it. Your husband's bull, what are the symptoms?" Martha described them in a rush: sudden weakness, unable to stand, rapid breathing, confusion. Clara listened with focused attention, asked 3 sharp questions, then grabbed her medical bag from the barn. "I'll come. Ethan, finish treating those burns. Jimmy, start clearing this debris before someone gets hurt on it." She climbed into Martha's wagon without hesitation, despite having just fought a fire for 2 hours. "How far is your property?" 20 minutes by wagon, but if we hurry—" They were gone before Martha finished the sentence, leaving Ethan standing in the ruins of the eastern paddock with a growing sense that something fundamental had just shifted. Clara had been fighting for the ranch because it was the practical thing to do, because she'd made a contract and intended to honor it. But now someone had attacked them directly, had tried to destroy what they were building. Now it was personal. She returned 4 hours later, driving Martha's wagon herself, her expression grim but satisfied. Martha sat beside her, crying with relief. "Grass tetany," Clara explained as she climbed down, accepting Ethan's steadying hand. "Magnesium deficiency. The bull had been grazing new spring grass that was low in minerals. I administered magnesium sulfate directly into the vein. He was standing within an hour." "She saved him," Martha said, wiping her eyes. "Harold was ready to slaughter him for meat, said it was the only way to salvage anything. But Mrs. Crowley knew exactly what was wrong and how to fix it. That bull's worth $300. She saved our whole year." Martha pressed money into Clara's hand. $15, more than her usual fee, payment that clearly represented real sacrifice from a family that didn't have much to spare. Clara tried to refuse the extra, but Martha was adamant. You came after fighting a fire that destroyed your own property. Didn't hesitate, didn't make excuses, just came and did what needed doing. Martha gripped Clara's soot-stained hands. That's worth more than money can measure. After Martha left, Clara stood in the yard, staring at the $15 in her palm with an expression Ethan couldn't quite read. The sun was setting, painting the burned paddock in shades of red and gold that looked almost beautiful if you didn't know what you were seeing. We need to tell people, Clara said quietly. About the fire, about the timing, about the fact that someone tried to sabotage us. Without proof, it's just an accusation. Could backfire, make us look desperate or paranoid. Then we don't accuse. We simply tell the truth. We were sabotaged. We don't know by whom, but we're continuing anyway. We survived poisoned horses, and we'll survive this too. Clara looked up at him, and in the failing light, Ethan saw something in her eyes that might have been hope or might have been defiance. People respect resilience. They might suspect who's responsible, but they'll admire that we're not giving up. She was right. Over the next week, as word spread about the fire and Clara's response, leaving her own burned property to save Martha Hendricks's bull without hesitation, public opinion began to shift in ways Ethan hadn't anticipated. The fire that was meant to destroy their credibility instead became proof of Clara's dedication. The sabotage that was meant to break them instead became a rallying point. Clients kept coming, some specifically because they'd heard about the fire and wanted to support someone who'd been treated unfairly. A few even mentioned Brennan's name in quiet tones, suggesting they'd heard rumors about his involvement, though no one had direct proof. Clara worked 16-hour days, treating animals, clearing hemlock from the south field, rebuilding the burned paddock fence with Jimmy's help. Ethan sold the last of his father's prize horses to a buyer from Wyoming, bringing in another $400. They made their first weekly payment to the bank, $53, just over the minimum required. 28 days until the final deadline, $647 in Clara's locked box. Not enough, not nearly enough, but moving in the right direction. Then the second disaster struck. Ethan was in town picking up supplies when he heard the shouting from Miller's General Store. He hurried inside to find a crowd gathered around Tom Chen, whose face was twisted with grief and rage. Dead, Tom was saying, his voice breaking. All three of them. Found them this morning in the pasture. Same symptoms as the Crowley horses. Foam at the mouth, convulsions, gone within hours. Ethan's blood went cold. Your horses. But they were fine. Clara treated your gelding. He recovered. Not the gelding. 3 others. The ones that hadn't been sick. Tom's eyes found Ethan in the crowd, and what Ethan saw there made his stomach drop. The ones I started grazing in the north pasture 2 weeks ago, like your wife suggested. Said it would be safe. Said she'd checked it for poison plants. She was wrong. The crowd's murmur went from sympathetic to suspicious. Walter Miller spoke up from behind the counter, his voice carefully neutral. Are you sure it's the same thing? I brought her out to look. She confirmed it. Water hemlock, same as before. But she'd told me that pasture was clean, said she'd surveyed it herself. Tom's hands clenched into fists. 3 horses dead because I trusted her judgment, because I believed she knew what she was doing. Tom, I'm sure Clara didn't, Ethan started, but Tom cut him off. Didn't what? Didn't make a mistake that cost me 3 animals? Didn't give me false assurance that got them killed? His voice rose, echoing off the store's walls. She's been wrong this whole time, and we've all been too desperate or too stupid to see it. The Crowley horses recovered because they were lucky, not because she's some kind of miracle worker. And now I've got 3 dead horses because I believed in miracles. Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to defend Clara, but he could see the doubt spreading through the crowd like poison. These were people who'd started to believe, who'd brought Clara their sick animals and paid her good money based on faith that she knew more than the local veterinarian. Now that faith was cracking, and with it, everything they'd built over the last month. He left the store without buying anything, drove the wagon back to the ranch faster than was wise. Found Clara in the barn, treating a sheep with infected hooves, her expression focused and calm. We've got a problem, Ethan said. Clara looked up, saw his face, and set down her tools. Tell me. He told her about Tom Chen, the 3 dead horses, the crowd at Miller's turning against her, watched her face go still and white, watched her hands curl into fists at her sides. I checked that pasture, she said quietly. Spent an entire morning surveying it, found nothing. Could you have missed something? Could it have grown since you checked? Water hemlock doesn't appear overnight. If it's there now, it was there then. Claire's voice was steady, but her eyes had gone hard. Unless it wasn't. What do you mean? I mean someone planted it, deliberately, knowing Tom would graze there, knowing it would kill his horses, knowing he'd blame me. Clara stood, began pacing the barn's narrow aisle. The fire didn't work. We recovered too quickly, gained too much sympathy, so they changed tactics. Made it look like my methods are fraudulent, that my expertise can't be trusted. Brennan again? Who else has the knowledge and the motive? Who else would benefit from destroying my reputation right when it's becoming valuable? Clara stopped pacing, turned to face Ethan directly. This wasn't an accident. This was calculated, deliberate sabotage designed to turn people against us at the worst possible moment. Even if you're right, how do we prove it? How do we convince people that someone would go to such lengths? Clara was quiet for a long moment, thinking. When she spoke, her voice carried a cold certainty that made Ethan's spine straighten. We set a trap. We give them an opportunity too good to resist, and we catch them in the act. She met his eyes. But it's going to require something from you that you won't want to give. What? Trust, complete trust, and the willingness to risk everything we've built on one final gamble. Ethan thought about his father, about the ranch that was slowly dying despite their best efforts, about the bank's deadline that was approaching faster than their income could possibly meet. Thought about Clara, who'd walked into hell without flinching and fought for a home that wasn't even hers yet. Tell me what you need, he said. Clara smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a woman who'd been pushed too far and was finally pushing back. We spread a rumor, she said, tomorrow, about a new treatment, something revolutionary that will save even the most poisoned animals. We tell people we're testing it on our own livestock first, keeping them in a specific pasture that we've prepared specially. We make it sound too good to be true. And then? And then we wait for someone to poison that pasture, and when they do, we'll be watching. The plan was dangerous and possibly insane, but Ethan found himself agreeing to it anyway, watching Clara's mind work through details with the precision of a general planning a campaign. They would need witnesses, she said, people who could testify to what they saw, people whose word carried weight in Twisted Pine. Jimmy's too young, too connected to us, Claire said, pacing the barn while Ethan listened. They'd dismiss him as loyal help covering for his employer. We need someone neutral, someone respected. Doc Henshaw? Too proud. He already resents that I'm doing work he considers his territory. He'd never agree to help prove I'm right, and he's been useless. Clara stopped, turned. What about the minister? Reverend Patterson? He's fair-minded, known for not taking sides in disputes. Ethan considered. But getting him to spend a night watching a pasture on the off chance someone shows up to poison it? That's asking a lot. Then we don't tell him that's what we're doing. We tell him we need a neutral observer to document a new treatment protocol, someone whose testimony can't be questioned. Claire's expression was calculating. He thinks he's witnessing medical innovation. We get a credible witness who happens to be in position when something else entirely occurs. It was manipulative and brilliant and ethically questionable, but Ethan was past the point of caring about the ethics of survival. They were being sabotaged by someone with resources and reach, someone who'd already burned their property and killed innocent animals to destroy their credibility. Fighting fair seemed like a luxury they couldn't afford. The next morning, Clara drove into town alone, made a point of stopping at Miller's general store during the busiest hour. Ethan had wanted to go with her, to provide support or protection or something, but she'd refused. This only works if I look confident, she'd said. If I walk in there strong and unbothered by Tom Chen's accusations. If I go with you at my side, it looks like I need defending. So she'd gone alone, wearing her best dress, hair pulled back in that severe style that made her look like she could stare down a charging bull. Ethan waited at the ranch, working on fence repairs with hands that shook slightly every time he thought about what they were attempting. Clara returned 3 hours later with a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "It's done," she said, climbing down from the wagon with the careful movements of someone who'd been holding tension in their spine for too long. "I made a scene, told Walter Miller in front of half the town that I'd developed a new treatment protocol, something that could reverse even advanced poisoning if administered quickly enough. Said I was testing it on our own livestock first, keeping them in the west pasture under careful observation. Did people believe you? Some did, some didn't, but they all listened." Clara pulled off her gloves, flexed her fingers. "And Robert Brennan was there, heard every word." Ethan's stomach tightened. "He was at Miller's?" "Conveniently picking up supplies. Stood in the back, pretending not to pay attention, but I saw him listening, saw the calculation in his eyes." Clara met Ethan's gaze. "If I'm right about him, he won't be able to resist. A chance to discredit this new treatment before it can be proven, to show once and for all that I'm a fraud. He'll take it. And if you're wrong, if it's not him, then we waste a few nights watching an empty pasture, and I have to accept that maybe I really did miss the hemlock in Tom's north field, that maybe I'm not as good at this as I thought." Clara's voice wavered for just a moment, showing the doubt beneath the steel. "But I'm not wrong, Ethan. I can't be." They prepared the west pasture that afternoon, moving 2 of the recovering horses there along with a milk cow Clara had been treating for a minor infection. They made a show of it, ensuring anyone who happened to be watching would see animals being deliberately placed in that specific location. Then Ethan rode to the church and found Reverend Patterson in his small office, reviewing Sunday's sermon notes. "Ethan." The Reverend stood, offering his hand with genuine warmth. He was a soft-spoken man in his 50s, with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent decades listening to people's troubles. "I heard about the fire. Terrible business. And Tom Chen's horses. I've been meaning to ride out and offer what comfort I could. Actually, that's why I'm here." Ethan sat when Patterson gestured to a chair. "My wife has developed a new treatment, something that could help animals even after they've been exposed to toxins. But given recent events, given people's doubts, she needs a credible witness to observe and document the protocol." Patterson's eyebrows rose. "She wants me to verify her methods. She wants someone whose integrity is beyond question to watch what she does and testify to the results. You've got no stake in whether she succeeds or fails. Your word would carry weight." Ethan leaned forward. "I know it's an unusual request, but Clara's reputation is being destroyed by circumstances that may or may not be her fault. She deserves a fair chance to prove her methods work." The Reverend was quiet for a long moment, studying Ethan with those patient eyes that seemed to see more than was comfortable. Finally, he nodded. "When?" "Tonight, and possibly the next few nights. She's monitoring the animals closely, documenting any changes. Having you there to witness would make the documentation irrefutable." "What time should I arrive?" "After dark, 8 o'clock. And Reverend?" Ethan hesitated. "Bring warm clothes. It might be a long night." Patterson arrived promptly at 8, dressed in a heavy coat and carrying a Bible he probably brought everywhere. Clara greeted him with the same professional courtesy she showed all her clients, explained that she'd be monitoring the animals hourly throughout the night, checking vital signs and documenting any changes in their condition. "I'm testing a new combination of treatments," she told him, her voice carrying just enough technical detail to sound credible without being overwhelming. "The theory is that certain compounds can bond with toxins in the bloodstream and help the body eliminate them faster, but it requires precise timing and careful observation." What she didn't mention was that the new treatment was actually just standard supportive care she'd been providing all along. The real purpose of the night wasn't to test anything. It was to watch and wait for someone to arrive with malicious intent. They settled into position in the barn loft, which offered a clear view of the west pasture while keeping them hidden from casual observation. Clara had brought blankets and hot coffee in a thermos. Jimmy was positioned near the house, ready to ride for the sheriff at a signal. Ethan had his father's rifle, though he hoped desperately he wouldn't need to use it. The first night passed in tense silence, broken only by Clara's periodic trips down to check the animals, maintaining the illusion that she was conducting serious medical observation. Reverend Patterson watched with quiet interest, asking occasional questions about her methods that Clara answered with practiced ease. Nothing happened. No midnight visitors, no suspicious activity, just a cold Montana night and 3 people watching animals sleep peacefully in a pasture. The second night followed the same pattern. Patterson was starting to look skeptical. Clara was starting to look worried, and Ethan was starting to wonder if they'd been wrong about everything. The third night, just past midnight, they heard hoofbeats. Clara stiffened beside Ethan, her hand finding his in the darkness and squeezing once before letting go. Below, in the west pasture, the horses stirred, sensing the approach of something unfamiliar. A rider appeared at the fence line, dark against the starlit sky, moving with the careful silence of someone who didn't want to be seen. Ethan raised the rifle, more for show than anything else, and watched as the figure dismounted, pulled something from a saddlebag and began working at the fence. The movements were methodical, practiced, someone who knew what they were doing and had done it before. "Stay here," Ethan whispered to Clara and Patterson. "Jimmy's going for the sheriff, but I'm not letting whoever that is finish what they started." Clara grabbed his arm. "Don't be stupid. We need them to actually do something incriminating before we confront them." She was right, but every instinct screamed at Ethan to stop what was happening right now, before another animal got hurt. He forced himself to wait, to watch as the figure worked their way along the fence line, scattering something among the grass in careful, deliberate patterns. Poison. They were planting poison, exactly as Clara had predicted. The figure had nearly finished when the sound of galloping horses announced Jimmy's return with Sheriff Morrison. The rider heard them coming, tried to mount and flee, but Ethan was already moving, Clara right behind him despite his shouted order for her to stay put. They reached the figure as the sheriff's horse thundered into the yard, lanterns blazing, multiple voices shouting commands. The rider turned, and in the sudden flood of light, Ethan saw not Robert Brennan's face, but someone he recognized anyway. Martin Reeves, Brennan's foreman and right-hand man for the past decade. "Don't move," Sheriff Morrison commanded, his gun drawn and pointed at Reeves with steady authority. "Martin Reeves, you're under arrest for trespassing and destruction of property. Maybe attempted murder if any of these animals die from whatever you've been spreading around." Reeves's face went through several expressions in quick succession: shock, fear, calculation, and finally resignation. This isn't, he swallowed hard. "I want a lawyer." "You'll get one, after we search your saddlebags and see what you brought with you tonight." Morrison dismounted, gestured for his deputy to secure Reeves. "And after you explain what you were doing on the Crowley property at midnight, scattering substances around a pasture containing livestock." What they found in Reeves's saddlebags was enough water hemlock to kill everything in the west pasture twice over, along with a small notebook detailing previous instances of sabotage, amounts used, locations targeted. Tom Chen's north pasture was listed there, along with dates and quantities. So was the eastern paddock fire, though that entry just read "Lantern, hay bales, evening" in Reeves's cramped handwriting. Clara stood in the lantern light reading the notebook with an expression that cycled between vindication and fury. When she looked up, her eyes found Ethan's across the chaos of the sheriff's arrest. "I was right," she said quietly, "about all of it." Reverend Patterson had descended from the barn loft and was staring at the scene with something like horror on his kind face. "I don't understand. Why would Martin do this? What could he possibly gain?" "Martin wouldn't gain anything," Clara said, her voice hard. "But his employer would. The question is whether Mr. Reeves is brave enough to admit who ordered him to do it." Reeves's jaw clenched. "I'm not saying anything without a lawyer present." "Don't need you to," Morrison said grimly. "This notebook's pretty damn clear about who benefited from each instance of sabotage, and I imagine a judge will be very interested in exploring those connections." He turned to Ethan. "You'll need to come to town tomorrow, file formal charges. Bring Mrs. Crowley too. Her testimony about the poisoning will be crucial." They took Reeves away in handcuffs, leaving Ethan and Clara standing in the churned-up dirt of the west pasture with Reverend Patterson and Jimmy. The animals, oblivious to the drama, had gone back to their peaceful grazing, unaware they'd just been saved from yet another attempted murder. "I need to apologize," Patterson said quietly. "When you asked me to witness Clara's treatment protocol, I thought, I'll admit, I had doubts about her abilities, about whether she really knew what she claimed to know. But this He gestured at the pasture, the scattered hemlock that would have killed everything here by morning. You weren't testing a treatment, you were catching a criminal. We were doing both, Clara said. The treatment protocol was real. I have been monitoring these animals carefully. But yes, we also suspected someone would try to sabotage us again. We needed a witness no one could dismiss. You used me. We needed you, Ethan corrected. And we needed you to be able to testify honestly that you were here to observe medical treatment, that you saw someone attempt to poison our livestock, and that you can verify the animals were healthy before the sabotage attempt, all of which is true. Patterson was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. It's true, and I'll testify to it. But Ethan, Clara, this isn't over. Martin Reeves is just the hand that held the poison. The mind that planned it is still out there. Robert Brennan, Clara said flatly. We know, but proving it is another matter entirely. Maybe not as difficult as you think. Patterson pulled his coat tighter against the cold night air. I've been minister in this town for 23 years. I know things, hear things in confession, in casual conversation, in the silences between what people say and what they mean. Robert Brennan has been positioning himself to acquire this property for months. Everyone knows it, and everyone knows Martin Reeves doesn't scratch himself without Brennan's permission. Knowing and proving are different things, Ethan said. True, but juries are made up of people who live in this town. People who know both of you, know Brennan, know Reeves. Sometimes proving intent is less about physical evidence and more about pattern and motive. Patterson looked between them. You've got motive, Brennan's repeated attempts to buy your property. You've got pattern, multiple instances of sabotage that benefited only him. You've got opportunity, his foreman caught red-handed with poison and a notebook documenting previous attacks. A good prosecutor can build a compelling case from that. What Patterson didn't say, but what hung in the air anyway, was that a good defense attorney could probably tear it apart just as easily. Brennan had money, connections, and the kind of power that came from being the largest employer in the county. Reeves could claim he acted alone, motivated by personal grudge or insanity or any number of explanations that didn't implicate his boss. They'd caught the hand, but the mind remained free. News spread through Twisted Pine like wildfire in dry grass. By dawn, everyone knew that Martin Reeves had been arrested trying to poison the Crowley livestock. By mid-morning, everyone knew about the notebook documenting previous sabotage. By noon, speculation about Brennan's involvement had reached a fever pitch. Claire and Ethan rode into town together to file formal charges, and the atmosphere was electric with tension and gossip. People stopped them on the street, offering support, asking questions, expressing outrage that someone would deliberately harm innocent animals. Tom Chen found them outside the sheriff's office, his face twisted with guilt and shame. I owe you an apology, he said without preamble. Both of you. I blame Mrs. Crowley for my horses dying, said terrible things about her abilities, when all along someone was deliberately poisoning that pasture. I should have trusted your judgment. Claire's expression softened slightly. You were grieving. People say things in grief they don't mean. I meant them when I said them, but I was wrong. Tom pulled an envelope from his pocket, pressed it into Claire's hands. This doesn't make up for the damage my words did to your reputation, but it's something. Payment for all the consultations you've given me, including the one where you tried to help me understand what killed my horses. I never paid you for that. Clara opened the envelope, found $50 inside. Tom, this is too much. It's not enough. You've saved animals all over this county, and half the time you undercharge or don't charge at all because you know people are struggling. You've earned every penny of that and more. He met her eyes directly. I've already talked to Walter Miller, Sarah Morrison, and a dozen other people whose animals you've treated. We're all prepared to testify at any trial about your skill and character, about how you've helped this community even when parts of it turned on you. Something in Claire's expression cracked, just slightly, showing the vulnerability beneath the steel. Thank you, she said quietly. That means more than the money. After Tom left, Ethan took Claire's hand, felt her fingers trembling despite her calm exterior. You all right? I'm fine, just... She shook her head. I spent so long being certain I was right, being certain someone was sabotaging us. Part of me wondered if I was becoming paranoid, if I was seeing conspiracies where there was only bad luck and my own incompetence. To have proof, to know I wasn't crazy. You were never crazy. You were right about everything. They filed charges against Reeves for trespassing, attempted destruction of property, and criminal endangerment. Sheriff Morrison took their statements with grim efficiency, then leaned back in his chair and spoke in a low voice meant only for them. Off the record, I think Brennan put him up to this. I've known Martin Reeves since he was a kid. He's not bright enough to plan something this systematic on his own, but proving Brennan ordered it is going to be damn near impossible unless Reeves talks, and he's lawyered up tight. What if he's convinced talking is his best option? Clara asked. Morrison raised an eyebrow. How do you propose we convince him of that? By making it clear that Brennan is going to hang him out to dry. That when this goes to trial, Brennan will claim complete ignorance, will paint Reeves as a rogue employee acting on his own grudge, will sacrifice him without hesitation to protect himself. Clara's voice was calm, analytical. If Reeves understands he's being abandoned, that cooperating is his only chance at a reduced sentence, he might decide honesty serves his interests better than loyalty. Morrison considered this. That would require Brennan actually abandoning him. And I can't see Brennan being stupid enough to do that publicly when it would look so obviously guilty. Then we help him make that choice. Clara stood, brushed dust from her skirt with deliberate care. We force his hand, make him choose between standing by Reeves and protecting his own reputation, and we make sure everyone in town is watching when he makes that choice. That evening, Clara drafted a letter to the Twisted Pine Gazette, the weekly newspaper that served as the town's primary source of information and gossip. The letter was a masterpiece of careful wording. She described the sabotage attempts, praised Sheriff Morrison's quick response, expressed gratitude for the community's support, and mentioned in passing that she hoped Mr. Brennan, as the largest rancher in the area and Reeves's employer, would assist the investigation by providing any information he might have about his foreman's activities and motivations. The letter was published 2 days later, and Brennan's response was immediate and predictable. He issued his own statement expressing shock and dismay at his foreman's actions, claiming complete ignorance of any sabotage, and stating that Reeves had been immediately terminated from employment effective the date of his arrest. He abandoned him, Ethan said, reading the newspaper at the kitchen table while Clara prepared dinner. Just like you said he would. He had no choice. Standing by Reeves would have looked like tacit approval of the sabotage. But throwing him under the wagon this publicly, this completely, Clara smiled grimly. Reeves is going to feel that betrayal. And when people feel betrayed, they talk. She was right. 3 days later, Sheriff Morrison sent word that Reeves wanted to negotiate. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he was prepared to provide detailed testimony about who had ordered the sabotage, how long it had been planned, and what the ultimate goal had been. The testimony was damning. Brennan had approached Reeves 6 months ago, right after Thomas Crowley's death, with a simple proposition: make the ranch fail, and Reeves would receive a generous bonus when Brennan acquired the property at a distressed price. The initial plan had been subtle. Small acts of negligence, minor sabotage that could be explained as accidents or bad luck. But then Clara had arrived and started solving problems, and the sabotage had escalated. The fire. The planted hemlock in Tom Chen's pasture. The attempted poisoning of the West pasture animals. Each act designed to destroy Clara's credibility and force Ethan into selling. With Reeves's testimony and the physical evidence from the notebook, the prosecutor felt confident bringing charges against Brennan himself: conspiracy to commit fraud, criminal endangerment, attempted destruction of property. The trial was set for 3 weeks out. Those 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and testimony, and the surreal experience of watching their private struggle become public spectacle. The courtroom was packed for every session, people from Twisted Pine and surrounding areas cramming into seats to watch Robert Brennan, the powerful rancher, face justice for trying to destroy his neighbors. Clara testified with the same calm precision she brought to everything else, walking the jury through her investigation of the poisoned horses, her treatment protocols, her discovery of the sabotage pattern. Reverend Patterson testified about the night he'd witnessed Reeves planting poison. Tom Chen testified about his horses' deaths and how Clara had tried to warn him. A dozen other ranchers testified about Clara's skill and character. Reeves himself took the stand. looking smaller and more pathetic than he'd ever seemed when carrying out Brennan's orders. He laid out the entire conspiracy in flat, emotionless detail, never making excuses but also never showing remorse. He'd done what his boss had told him to do, and now his boss had abandoned him, and he was repaying that abandonment with the truth. Brennan's defense was exactly what Clara had predicted: shock, denial, claims that Reeves had acted alone based on some imagined grudge or mental instability. But the jury saw through it, saw the pattern of behavior that made sense only if Brennan had been pulling the strings. The verdict came back after 4 hours of deliberation: guilty on all counts. Brennan was sentenced to 5 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution to the Crowleys for damages, lost income, and emotional distress. The amount, $12,000, was more than enough to pay off the bank, clear all debts in town, and give them operating capital for the next year. Ethan sat in the courtroom, hearing the sentence pronounced, and felt something break loose in his chest that he hadn't realized had been locked there. Relief, maybe. Or vindication. Or just the simple knowledge that they'd survived, that they'd fought back against someone with more power and more resources and won anyway. Clara's hand found his under the courtroom table, squeezed once, then let go. Her face showed nothing, no triumph, no satisfaction, just the same calm competence she'd shown from the moment she'd stepped into his dying stable weeks ago. Outside the courthouse, people crowded around them, offering congratulations, expressing satisfaction at the verdict, asking Clara about treatments for their animals. She fielded every question with patience and professionalism, gave out advice freely, promised to make house calls to several ranches in the coming weeks. Walter Miller pushed through the crowd, his weathered face creased in an apologetic smile. "Mrs. Crowley, I owe you an apology too. I was slow to extend credit when you first arrived, doubted your abilities like everyone else. I should have trusted Ethan's judgment and your own credentials." "You were protecting your business," Clara said simply. "I don't fault you for that. Still, I'd like to make amends. Your credit at the store is unlimited from now on, and I've been talking to some of the other merchants. We'd like to sponsor a proper clinic for you. A building in town where people can bring animals for treatment instead of you having to ride out to every ranch. We'll cover the first year's rent." Clara's composure slipped for just a moment, surprise and gratitude flashing across her face before the mask came back. "That's very generous, Walter, thank you." They drove back to the ranch in the golden light of late afternoon, the wagon loaded with supplies purchased on credit that they could now actually afford to repay. The landscape that had seemed so hostile and unforgiving just weeks ago looked almost welcoming now, the Montana sky stretching endlessly overhead in shades of blue and gold. "We won," Ethan said quietly. "We survived," Clara corrected. Winning implies the fight is over. We still have a ranch to run, a business to build, a future to secure." "You don't know how to celebrate, do you?" Clara smiled, and it was the first genuinely happy expression Ethan had seen on her face since she'd arrived. "I'll celebrate when we've paid off every debt, when the horses are healthy, when the south field is completely cleared of hemlock, when your father's legacy is not just preserved but thriving." She looked at him. "Then I'll celebrate." They reached the ranch as the sun touched the horizon, painting everything in warm light that made the buildings look almost golden. Jimmy came running from the barn, his young face split in a grin. "You won. Whole town's talking about nothing else. Is it true Brennan has to pay you $12,000? "It's true," Ethan confirmed, climbing down from the wagon, "every penny of it going toward making this place what it used to be." "Better than it used to be," Clara said, joining them. She looked at the ranch, the repaired paddock, the cleared pastures, the healthy horses grazing in the distance, and nodded with satisfaction. "Your father built something remarkable, Ethan, but he built it alone, in a time when that was possible. The world's changing. Now it takes partnerships, takes different kinds of expertise working together, takes being willing to adapt and evolve." She was talking about more than the ranch, and Ethan knew it. Talking about the contract marriage that had become a genuine partnership, about the stranger who'd become essential, about two people who'd faced disaster together and come out stronger for it. "We should make it official," Ethan said suddenly. "The marriage. We've been so focused on survival that we never actually—" "Had a ceremony? Filed the papers?" Clara's expression was unreadable. "We could do that." Or we could keep things as they are, partners in business, if not in law. It's worked well enough so far. Is that what you want? Clara was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun sink lower. When she spoke, her voice was softer than Ethan had ever heard it. I spent 6 years in a marriage bound by law and love, and I watched my husband die in debt with nothing to show for all that binding. I came here expecting a contract, a transaction, something clean and practical that wouldn't break my heart when it inevitably ended. She turned to face him directly. But this, what we've built here, this feels more solid than anything legal documents could make it. So yes, that's what I want. To keep building, keep fighting, keep surviving together. Whether we call it marriage or partnership or something else entirely doesn't matter as much as the fact that we do it together. Ethan understood. After everything they'd been through, official titles seemed almost irrelevant. They'd forged something stronger than legal bonds in the fires of sabotage and survival, something that didn't need a ceremony to make it real. Together then, he agreed, however we define it. They stood in the fading light, watching the ranch settle into evening, and for the first time in months, Ethan felt something that might have been peace. The bank was satisfied. The debts were cleared. The saboteur was in prison. The animals were healthy. And the woman standing beside him had proven herself more capable and resilient than anyone had imagined. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The clinic to set up, the practice to expand, the ranch to restore. But tonight, they could rest in the knowledge that they'd survived the worst and come out victorious. The Montana sky darkened overhead, stars beginning to emerge in the deepening blue. Inside the house, Ethan could see the lamp Jimmy had lit in the kitchen, warm light spilling from the windows. Home. Not perfect, not without scars, but theirs. Built not by one person's vision, but by multiple hands working toward a common goal. Come on, Clara said, breaking the moment. We've got horses to feed and chores to finish. Tomorrow we can start planning the future. Tonight, we just do the work. And that, Ethan thought as he followed her toward the barn, was perhaps the most honest summary of their entire relationship. Not grand declarations or romantic gestures, but simply showing up day after day to do the work that needed doing, together. The work, as it turned out, never really stopped. 3 weeks after Brennan's conviction, Clara's makeshift clinic in the barn was treating an average of 4 animals a day, with consultations scheduled out 2 weeks in advance. The building Walter Miller had offered in town sat empty while Clara worked from dawn to dusk at the ranch, claiming she didn't have time to set up a proper office when animals needed her here and now. Ethan watched her push herself relentlessly, sleeping maybe 5 hours a night, eating meals standing up between patients, documenting every case in her growing collection of notebooks with the obsessive precision of someone who couldn't afford to make mistakes. She was building something, he understood that. Building a reputation so solid that no one would ever question her abilities again. Building an income stream so reliable that the bank would never threaten them again. Building a future so secure that disaster couldn't touch it. But she was also running from something, though she'd never admit it. Running from the fear that everything could collapse again, that all their victories were temporary, that safety was an illusion that could shatter at any moment. It was Jimmy who finally voiced what Ethan had been thinking. The young man cornered him in the tack room one morning, his expression worried. She's going to work herself to death, Jimmy said bluntly. I know she's trying to build the practice, but she hasn't taken a day off in 3 weeks. Yesterday she nearly passed out treating the Hendersons' bull. Said she was fine, but I saw her hands shaking after. I know. Ethan had seen it too, the way Clara's movements were becoming mechanical, the way her eyes had developed permanent dark circles, the way she flinched at sudden noises like someone expecting the next disaster to arrive at any moment. But try telling her to slow down. She's convinced that stopping means losing everything. Then don't tell her to stop. Tell her to redirect. Jimmy pulled a newspaper from his back pocket, unfolded it to show an advertisement. The cattle exposition in Helena. 3 days. Biggest ranchers from 5 states, all bringing their animals to show and sell. If Mrs. Crowley set up there, she could see 100 potential clients, build connections with people who have real money to spend on veterinary care. Ethan studied the advertisement. The exposition was in 2 weeks, would require travel and preparation and taking time away from the steady stream of local clients. Clara would resist, would argue that they couldn't afford to lose 3 days of income, that abandoning their current clients was irresponsible. But Jimmy was right. Clara needed to see that they'd built something sustainable enough to survive her absence. And more than that, she needed to be forced out of the relentless cycle of work and worry that was consuming her. He found her in the barn that evening, treating a mare with an infected cut on her foreleg. The mare's owner, a rancher named Davies from 20 miles out, was watching Clara work with the reverent attention people had started showing her, part respect, part awe, part desperate hope that she could fix whatever was broken. Keep it clean, change the dressing daily, and if you see any red streaking up the leg, send for me immediately, Clara instructed, wrapping the final layer of bandage with practiced efficiency. She should be sound in a week, maybe 10 days. Davies paid her $8, thanked her profusely, and led his mare away into the gathering darkness. Clara stood in the barn doorway, watching him go, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion the moment she thought no one was looking. "We need to talk about Helena," Ethan said from behind her. Clara turned, and he saw her defenses come up immediately. "What about Helena?" "The cattle exposition. Jimmy showed me the advertisement. 3 days? Major ranchers from across the region, perfect opportunity to expand your client base beyond local farms." "I can't afford to leave for 3 days. I have appointments scheduled, animals that need regular treatment, clients who depend on clients who will still be here when you get back." Ethan moved closer, kept his voice gentle but firm. "Clara, you're building something remarkable, but you're building it like the whole structure will collapse if you stop hammering for even a moment. It won't. We've got Jimmy, we've got a stable income, we've got enough saved to weather a few days without new business." "You don't understand." "I understand that you're terrified, that you spent years watching your first husband destroy himself with debt and overwork, and now you're determined to never be that vulnerable again. But you're going to burn out, Clara. And when you do, everything you've built will fall apart anyway because you won't be able to sustain it." Clara's face went white, then flushed with anger. "How dare you psychoanalyze me? You know nothing about what I went through, what I sacrificed, what I—" She stopped, breathing hard, fists clenched at her sides. "You're right," Ethan said quietly. "I don't know the details. You've never told me. But I can see what it's doing to you now, and I'm telling you that this pace is unsustainable. Helena isn't just about business, it's about proving to yourself that what we've built is strong enough to survive you taking a breath." Clara stood rigid for a long moment, clearly fighting some internal battle. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "When my husband died, I was left with $3,000 in debt, and a practice that collapsed the moment people learned he was gone. Every creditor he'd ever extended trust to came calling at once, demanding immediate payment, threatening legal action. I spent 2 years working 20-hour days at the charity hospital, taking any shift they'd give me, living on bread and coffee, to pay off every penny he owed." She turned to face him fully, and Ethan saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, though her voice remained steady. "I swore when I finally cleared that debt that I would never be that helpless again. Never be dependent on someone else's legacy or someone else's decisions. Never stop working long enough for disaster to catch me. So yes, I'm terrified. Every single day I wake up terrified that this is the day it all falls apart, that I'll lose everything we've built, that I'll end up right back where I started, alone, in debt, with nothing but my own 2 hands to dig myself out." Ethan felt something crack in his chest at the raw pain in her voice. He'd known she'd been a widow, known her husband had left debts, but he hadn't understood the depth of trauma that experience had carved into her. Hadn't understood that every hour she worked herself to exhaustion was an hour spent outrunning that fear. "You're not alone this time," he said. "You're not digging yourself out with just your own hands. You've got me, you've got Jimmy, you've got a whole town that respects what you've done and will support you through difficulties. And you're not your first husband, you're not making reckless decisions or taking on debt you can't repay. You're building something sustainable and smart and profitable. You don't know that it's sustainable. We've had 3 good weeks. That's nothing. That's not enough time to prove anything except that we got lucky temporarily. Then come to Helena and prove it can last. Show yourself and everyone else that your practice is strong enough to expand beyond Twisted Pine. That you're not just the woman who saved the Crowley horses, You're a legitimate veterinary consultant who can compete at the regional level. Clara was quiet for so long that Ethan thought she might refuse. Then she nodded once, sharp and decisive. Fine. But we're not going as some kind of vacation. We're going to work. I'll need to prepare demonstration materials, bring case studies, have references ready from current clients. If we're doing this, we're doing it right. Of course she would turn it into more work, more preparation, more opportunity to drive herself harder. But at least she was agreeing to go, to step outside the safe confines of the ranch and test whether what they'd built could withstand exposure to a larger world. The 2 weeks before Helena passed in a blur of preparation, Clara assembled portfolios documenting her successful treatments, gathered written testimonials from grateful clients, practiced explaining her diagnostic methods in terms that would resonate with ranchers who cared more about results than medical theory. Ethan handled the logistics, booking rooms at a boarding house near the exposition grounds, arranging transportation, ensuring Jimmy could manage the ranch in their absence. The night before they were scheduled to leave, Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway looking uncertain in a way Ethan had never seen from her. She was holding a dress, her best one, dark blue with simple trim, the kind of thing a respectable woman would wear to church or formal occasions. Is this appropriate for the exposition? She asked. I don't know what people wear to these things. I don't want to look out of place or unprofessional. Ethan looked up from the travel documents he'd been reviewing, saw the vulnerability beneath the question. Clara, who could face down a charging bull without flinching, was nervous about fitting in at a cattle exposition. The contradiction would have been funny if it wasn't so telling. You'll be the most professional person there, he assured her. Most ranchers show up in their work clothes covered in dust and manure. You could wear a feed sack and still look more put together than 90% of the attendees. Clara's mouth twitched toward a smile. Somehow, I don't think a feed sack would inspire confidence in my medical expertise. Probably not, but the blue dress is perfect. Wear that and bring the work clothes too, in case you need to do actual examinations. They left at dawn the next morning, the wagon loaded with Clara's supplies and documentation. The drive to Helena took most of the day, the landscape gradually shifting from open rangeland to the bustling outskirts of Montana's capital city. Clara grew quieter as they approached, her hands twisting in her lap, betraying nerves she wouldn't voice aloud. The exposition grounds were enormous. Acres of temporary pens and display areas, hundreds of cattle and horses, thousands of people moving between exhibits and demonstration areas. The noise was overwhelming after weeks of quiet ranch life, the smell of animals and humanity concentrated into a space that seemed to vibrate with commerce and competition. Clara stood at the entrance, taking it all in with wide eyes. I didn't realize it would be this large. Second biggest cattle exposition in the western states, Ethan said, consulting the program he'd picked up at the gate. There's a veterinary demonstration area near the center. That's where you'll want to set up. They made their way through the crowds, Clara clutching her portfolio like a shield. The veterinary area was smaller than Ethan had expected. Maybe a dozen practitioners with booths displaying their credentials and services. Most were men, older, with impressive-looking certificates and testimonials from prestigious clients. Clara looked at them, and Ethan saw her confidence waver. I don't belong here, she said quietly. Look at these people. They've got degrees from universities, decades of experience, endorsements from governors and senators. I'm just a widow who learned medicine from her husband and got lucky treating some poisoned horses. You're the woman who diagnosed water hemlock poisoning that a licensed veterinarian missed, Ethan corrected firmly. Who developed treatment protocols that saved 6 animals everyone else had given up on. Who built a thriving practice in 6 weeks through skill and determination. That's not luck, Clara. That's expertise. Before she could respond, a voice called out from one of the nearby booths. Mrs. Crowley? Clara Whitmore Crowley? They turned to find a well-dressed man in his 50s approaching, his face creased in a smile of recognition. I heard you might be here. Charles Whitmore. No relation, though the shared name caught my attention when I read about the Brennan trial. I'm the territorial veterinary supervisor. Clara straightened, and Ethan saw her shift into professional mode. Mr. Whitmore, I'm honored to meet you. The honor is mine. That case you handled, the systematic poisoning identification and treatment, I used it as a teaching example at the Territorial Veterinary Conference last month. Brilliant diagnostic work, truly. How you isolated the specific toxin and developed targeted treatment protocols without access to a full laboratory is exactly the kind of practical field medicine we need more practitioners demonstrating. Claire's expression shifted from nervous to stunned. You used my case as a teaching example? Of course, it's textbook quality work. Whitmore gestured to an empty booth space. Are you setting up here? I'd love to discuss your methods in more detail. And I should introduce you to some of the other practitioners. We're always looking for skilled consultants willing to take on difficult cases in rural areas. What followed was 3 days that transformed everything. Whitmore introduced Clara to a network of veterinary practitioners across the territory, all of whom were impressed by her diagnostic abilities and practical treatment approaches. She gave an impromptu presentation on toxin identification, using the water hemlock case as an example, fielding questions from practitioners and ranchers alike with the confident expertise of someone who knew her subject inside and out. By the second day, Clara had a line of people waiting to consult with her about difficult cases, animals their own veterinarians couldn't diagnose, mysterious illnesses that defied conventional treatment, chronic conditions that seemed unsolvable. She examined animals, asked pointed questions, offered diagnostic suggestions that ranchers wrote down like they were receiving wisdom from an oracle. And they paid her. Not the modest fees she charged in Twisted Pine, but rates that reflected her expertise and the value of her consultations. $50 to spend an hour examining a breeding bull with unexplained fertility issues. $75 to diagnose a mysterious respiratory condition affecting an entire herd. $100 for developing a comprehensive treatment protocol for a ranch dealing with parasites that had developed resistance to conventional treatments. By the end of the third day, Clara had earned more than she'd made in the entire previous month in Twisted Pine. More importantly, she'd made connections with ranchers and veterinary practitioners who would send her referrals, who would pay for her expertise, who would hire her as a consultant for cases beyond their own capabilities. Ethan watched her work with growing awe. This was Clara in her element, not just treating animals, but solving puzzles, identifying patterns, teaching others while she worked. She belonged here in a way she'd never quite belonged in the barn at the ranch, constrained by local cases and limited resources. On the final evening of the exposition, they sat in the boarding house parlor, Clara counting the money she'd earned while Ethan tallied their expenses. The numbers were staggering. After subtracting travel costs and boarding fees, Clara had netted over $400 in 3 days. This is more than I imagined possible, Clara said quietly, staring at the bills in her hands like they might vanish if she looked away. If I could do this once a month, attend regional expositions, take on consulting cases, build a reputation beyond Twisted Pine, we could do more than just survive. We could actually thrive. You could do more than attend expositions, Ethan said. You could teach. Whitmore mentioned the territorial veterinary training program needs instructors for field medicine. You'd be perfect for that. Clara looked up, and for the first time since he'd known her, Ethan saw something that looked like genuine hope in her expression. Not the desperate, fearful hope of someone clinging to survival, but the bright, ambitious hope of someone seeing real possibilities. I never thought... She stopped, shook her head. When I came to Montana, I thought I was signing up for a quiet life managing a household, maybe helping with ranch bookkeeping. Nothing more than survival and safety. I never imagined I could build something this significant. Your first husband held you back, Ethan said, kept you in the shadows of his practice instead of recognizing what you were capable of on your own. You're not in anyone's shadow now. Clara was quiet for a long moment, then reached across the small table and took Ethan's hand. Thank you for pushing me to come here, for seeing what I couldn't see in myself, for... She paused, struggling with words. For being a true partner. Not just in name or contract, but in the ways that actually matter. They returned to Twisted Pine 3 days later to find the ranch not only surviving but running smoothly in their absence. Jimmy had handled the scheduled appointments, treated minor cases on his own using the protocols Clara had taught him, and referred more complex cases to Doc Henshaw with Clara's notes to guide diagnosis. Turns out the world doesn't end when you step away for a few days, Jimmy said with a grin as they unpacked the wagon. Though Mrs. Henderson's goat missed you something fierce, wouldn't let anyone else examine his infected hoof. Clara laughed. Actually laughed, a sound Ethan realized he'd heard far too rarely. Then I'll visit Mrs. Henderson tomorrow. Tonight, I'm going to sleep for 10 hours straight and not feel guilty about it. She kept that promise, and in the weeks that followed, something fundamental shifted in how Clara approached her work. She still worked hard, still maintained high standards, still drove herself to excellence. But she also started delegating to Jimmy, training him in basic diagnostic techniques and treatment protocols. Started scheduling rest days into her calendar, recognizing that sustainability required recovery time. Started accepting that the practice would survive her occasional absence because she'd built something strong enough to stand on its own. The clinic in town finally opened 2 months after the exposition, funded partially by the merchant's offer and partially by Clara's consulting fees. It was modest, a converted storefront with examination areas, a small laboratory for basic testing, and office space for record keeping. But it was professional, official, and most importantly, it established Clara as a permanent fixture in Twisted Pine's business community, rather than just the woman who'd saved the Crowley Ranch. Business thrived. Local ranchers brought their animals to the clinic for treatment, traveling practitioners referred difficult cases to Clara, and regional ranches hired her as a consultant for herd health management. The income was steady, reliable, and more than sufficient to not just maintain the ranch, but improve it. Ethan used the profits to buy 6 new horses, quality breeding stock that he could train and sell, rebuilding his father's legacy of producing excellent animals. He cleared the south field completely of water hemlock, hired help to properly survey and maintain all the pastures, and began slowly, carefully rebuilding what had been lost. But the rebuild wasn't just a restoration of what Thomas Crowley had created. It was something new, built on partnership rather than individual effort, on multiple streams of income rather than dependence on a single product, on resilience and adaptation rather than rigid tradition. 6 months after Clara's arrival, they hosted their first breeding auction. The horses Ethan had trained were well-muscled and well-tempered, the kind of animals that ranchers would pay premium prices for. Clara provided complimentary health evaluations for all the animals, demonstrating their soundness and quality to potential buyers. The auction brought in $3,000 in a single day. Combined with Clara's clinic income, they paid off the final balance to the bank weeks ahead of schedule. Frederick Walsh, the bank manager who'd been so skeptical of their ability to recover, personally delivered the marked paid paperwork to the ranch. He stood in the kitchen, looking around at the clean, well-maintained space, at Clara's medical texts lining the shelves, at the ledgers documenting months of profitable business. "I have to admit," Walsh said, "when you first came asking for an extension, I didn't think you'd make it. The odds were against you. Poisoned livestock, sabotage, debts piling up. Most people would have given up and sold to Brennan." "Most people didn't have Clara," Ethan said simply. Walsh nodded, glancing at Clara where she stood by the window, reviewing notes from her morning clinic appointments. "She's quite remarkable. The whole town's talking about her, you know. How she solved cases Doc Henshaw couldn't crack. How she exposed Brennan's sabotage. How she's brought in clients from 3 counties over. There's talk of nominating her for the Territorial Medical Board." Clara looked up at that, surprise evident on her face. "The medical board? I'm not even a licensed veterinarian. I never attended formal schooling." "You've got something better than formal schooling," Walsh said. "You've got a proven track record and the respect of everyone whose animals you've treated. In frontier territories, results matter more than credentials, and your results speak for themselves." After Walsh left, Clara stood holding the paid-in-full paperwork, staring at it like she couldn't quite believe it was real. "We did it," she said quietly. "We actually did it. Saved the ranch, cleared the debts, built something sustainable." "You did it," Ethan corrected. "I just provided the property and the problem. You provided everything else." Clara shook her head. "We did it together. I had the medical knowledge, you had the land and the connections. Jimmy had the loyalty and work ethic. Even the people who doubted us, Tom Chen, Walter Miller, the others, they came around and provided support when we proved ourselves. It wasn't one person's victory. It was a community effort." She was right, Ethan realized. The individual heroism narrative was appealing, but incomplete. They'd survived because multiple people had contributed different skills and resources, because partnerships had proven stronger than isolated effort, because adaptation had triumphed over rigid adherence to how things had always been done. That evening, they stood together on the porch, watching the sun set over pastures that now held healthy horses and cleared land. The ranch looked different than it had in Thomas Crowley's day, more diverse, more collaborative, less dependent on any single person's vision. But it was thriving in ways his father's ranch never had, generating income from multiple sources, built to withstand the kind of shocks that had nearly destroyed it months earlier. "I've been thinking," Clara said, breaking the comfortable silence, "about making this official. The partnership, I mean. Not just a business arrangement or a contract marriage, but an actual legal union." Ethan turned to look at her, saw the vulnerability in her expression despite the steady voice. This was Clara offering something she'd been afraid to offer, commitment that went beyond practical necessity, connection that acknowledged the emotional reality beneath their professional partnership. "I thought you didn't believe in the legal documents," he said gently. "Thought what we'd built was stronger than what papers could make it." "I did say that, and it's still true. What we have is stronger than legal bonds. But that doesn't mean the legal bonds aren't worth having too. They're not what creates the relationship, but they are a recognition of what already exists." Clara took a breath. "I'm not afraid anymore. Of commitment, of depending on someone, of building something that could be lost. You've proven yourself as a partner in ways that matter more than any vow could capture. So yes, I want to make it official. Not because we need it, but because we've earned it." Ethan felt something warm unfold in his chest, a feeling he'd thought he'd lost when he'd watched his father's legacy dying in the stable months ago. Hope, maybe. Or joy. Or just the simple recognition that sometimes survival transforms into something better, not just continuing to exist, but actually thriving. "Then we'll make it official," he agreed. "A proper ceremony with the whole town invited. A celebration of what we've built and where we're going." The wedding took place on a clear autumn morning, 6 weeks later. Reverend Patterson officiated in front of the church, the same church where Thomas Crowley's funeral had been held less than a year earlier. But this was no somber occasion. The church steps were packed with people from Twisted Pine and beyond, ranchers whose animals Clara had treated, merchants who'd extended credit in dark times, neighbors who'd watched the ranch's resurrection with amazement and respect. Clara wore a new dress, pale gray with simple, elegant lines, her hair finally released from its severe bun to fall in dark waves around her shoulders. She looked softer than Ethan had ever seen her, but no less fierce. A woman who'd fought her way through disaster and emerged victorious, claiming joy with the same determination she'd applied to survival. The vows were traditional, the words familiar from countless weddings before. But when Clara spoke them, promising to love and honor and cherish, Ethan heard the weight of everything they'd survived together, every challenge they'd faced, every victory they'd won. These weren't just ceremonial words. They were a recognition of a bond forged in fire and tempered to unbreakable strength. The reception was held at the ranch, tables set up in the yard, food provided by seemingly everyone in town who wanted to contribute. Walter Miller brought whiskey. Martha Hendricks brought her famous apple pies. Tom Chen brought a whole roasted pig. Doc Henshaw, who'd spent months resenting Clara's success, brought his grudging respect and a bottle of expensive imported wine. As the party wound down and the sun set, turning the Montana sky into streaks of red and gold, Clara found Ethan near the barn, both of them seeking a moment of quiet after hours of celebration. "This feels like an ending," Clara said, leaning against the barn wall beside him. "The final chapter. Ranch saved, debts cleared, villain defeated, couple married, neat and complete." "But it's not an ending," Ethan said. "It's a beginning of what comes next, of what we build from here." "What do we build?" Clara asked. "We've already accomplished what seemed impossible 6 months ago. Where do we go from here?" Ethan thought about his father, about the legacy Thomas Crowley had left, about the expectations that had weighed on him when he'd inherited the ranch. He'd spent months trying to preserve that legacy exactly as it had been, watching it crumble despite his best efforts. Only when he'd been willing to let it transform, to build something new from the ruins, had he found a path forward. "We build whatever we want," he said. "A ranch that produces quality horses, a veterinary practice that serves the territory, maybe a training facility where Clara can teach her methods to other practitioners, maybe a breeding program that combines my knowledge of horsemanship with Clara's understanding of animal health. Maybe something we haven't even imagined yet. Clara smiled, and it was the open, genuine smile of someone who'd stopped running from fear and started running toward possibility. I like that. Building toward something instead of just away from disaster. Creating instead of just surviving. We survived, Ethan agreed. Now we get to decide what we're surviving for. They stood together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the sounds of celebration winding down, the ranch quiet and solid around them. Everything that had seemed lost 6 months ago had been reclaimed and rebuilt. Not as it was, but as something better. The horses were healthy, the land was clear, the debts were paid. But more than that, they'd built a partnership that had proven strong enough to withstand sabotage, suspicion, disaster, and doubt. Inside the house, someone started playing a fiddle. The music drifted across the yard. A simple Montana tune that spoke of home and hard work and the quiet satisfaction of a day's labor well done. A few of the remaining guests began dancing, their shadows moving against the lamplight spilling from the windows. Clara took Ethan's hand, laced her fingers through his. Dance with me? I'm not much of a dancer. Neither am I. But I think we've earned the right to be bad at something together. They moved onto the makeshift dance floor some guests had cleared in the yard, joining the other couples swaying to the fiddle's tune. Clara was right. Neither of them was particularly skilled at dancing, but they moved together with the same partnership that had carried them through everything else, finding rhythm in the coordination rather than the individual steps. Around them, the ranch settled into evening. The horses nickered softly in their paddocks. The barn cats emerged to hunt mice in the growing darkness. The land that had seemed cursed and dying just months ago now thrived with life and possibility. This was what they'd fought for, Ethan realized. Not just survival or financial stability or vindication against enemies. They'd fought for the right to build a future on their own terms, to create something new from disaster's ruins, to prove that resilience and partnership could overcome even the most determined sabotage. They'd won. Not just the battles, but the war. Not just survival, but transformation. And as the music played and the stars emerged overhead, as Clara's hand stayed steady in his and her smile never wavered, Ethan understood that this moment of peace, hard-won, and joy earned through struggle, was worth every desperate hour they'd endured to reach it. The ranch would continue. The practice would grow. Life would bring new challenges and new opportunities. But whatever came next, they would face it together, building on the foundation they'd laid in fire and fury, creating a legacy not of what had been lost, but of what they'd chosen to build in its place. The fiddle played on into the night, and they danced. Two people who'd started as strangers bound by contract and become partners bound by choice, writing their future with every step, every breath, every moment of hard-won joy. And in the Montana darkness, under stars that had witnessed the ranch's near destruction and remarkable resurrection, the land itself seemed to settle with satisfaction, as if recognizing that what had been built here was stronger than what had been lost, and that sometimes the best legacies are the ones we create ourselves rather than the ones we inherit. The party eventually ended. The guests departed. The ranch grew quiet except for the natural sounds of animals and wind, and the old house settling into the night. Clara and Ethan stood on the porch long after the last guest had gone, watching the darkness, feeling the weight and wonder of everything they'd accomplished. "Ready to go inside?" Ethan asked finally. Clara nodded, but paused at the door, looking back one more time at the ranch spread out before them. "We really did it," she said, wonder in her voice. "We took something broken and made it whole. Something dying and brought it back to life. Something impossible and made it real." "We did," Ethan agreed. "And we'll do it again every time we need to. That's what partnership means." They went inside together, closing the door on the celebration, on the past, on everything that had tried to break them. And when the sun rose the next morning on the first day of their official life together, they woke to a ranch that was thriving, a practice that was growing, and a future that stretched ahead of them with limitless possibility. The legacy Thomas Crowley had built was gone, transformed into something new. But the new thing was better, stronger, more resilient, built on partnership rather than individual effort, on adaptation rather than tradition, on the fierce determination of two people who'd refused to give up when giving up would have been the reasonable choice. They'd survived. They'd won, And now they got to live.